Ira Majerti Hirna, the Anal Nife Carfoon, Conchina Studio in Arganivra, agus Nyarta Grosta, Evranuaran, Conida Horch Concretia, Onuskar Wetcha, a Hasofar ar Nilivriher, agus ar Niligania Fasta, agus Gurtriat, a Creek no for 3 Crease our Journa. Direct we beseech thee, O Lord, our actions by thy holy inspirations, and carry them on by thy gracious assistance, that every word and work of ours may always begin from thee and by thee, be happily ended through Christ our Lord. Amen. Just before we go to the Chief Whip, can we check that all the phones are on silent, please? Thank you. I understand the Chief Whip has a proposal to make.
Thank you, Laskin Corla. It's proposed that the arrangements for the week's business as set out in the revised report of the Business Committee be agreed to.
Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed. Now,
I greatly welcome the apology that's going to take place today. It's very welcome. It's grossly overdue.
Deputy McNamara.
No, it's on the order of business, but we also need to deal with apologies for what is happening now. In particular, what's happening at UHL.
Deputy, the order of business has been agreed. We now proceed to statements of acknowledgement and apology to the families and to the victims of the Stardust tragedy. And before calling on the Taoiseach, and on behalf of all of us, I want to acknowledge the presence here today of the families of the 48 victims of the Stardust fire. They're in the public gallery and they're in the Distinguished Visitors Gallery. Today's proceedings mark at its mildest an important milestone in their campaign on behalf of their loved ones. I just want to say, Céad Míle Fáilte Roimh Galéir is iontu. Thank you. I now call on the Taoiseach.
Laskin Corla, I want to join with you and beginning today by welcoming to the House the Stardust families who are gathered here with us in the chamber and in the gallery of Dáil Éireann. I know there have been many, many times when you thought this day would never come, over far too many, many years. I know that you were forced to endure a living nightmare which began when your loved ones were so cruelly snatched from you in a devastating fire. Their unfinished stories became your story, the defining story of your lives and the lives of your parents and other family members who left this life before ever seeing justice. I am deeply sorry that you were made to fight for so long that they went to their graves never knowing the truth. Today we say formally and without any equivocation, we are sorry. We failed you when you needed us the most. From the very beginning, we should have stood with you, but instead we forced you to stand against us. 48 young people lost their lives in the Stardust disaster. Many more were injured, and even more still had their lives broken and shattered forever. When I met with you in government buildings last Saturday, you reminded me of another time when 4 of your family members waited for days in the cold security hut, protesting your exclusion and hoping for access. I truly hope that the days since last Thursday have marked a turning point, and here today in Dáil Éireann, we finally begin to put things right. To bring you in from the cold and end the neglect of 43 years waiting and fighting for the only thing you ever wanted, the truth. Nothing else, no other agenda, just the truth. I hope this is a moment when the state, which rubbed salt in your terrible wounds, starts to help you heal. You asked me to try to really understand your experience, to really feel your pain, and to immerse myself in your world as you set out in your eloquent pen portraits to the inquest. There I found not only terrible anguish and unimaginable heartbreak, but also love, joy, laughter, personalities, promise, potential, slagging, messing, pride, dignity, talent, innocence, and the deep abyss of loss and loneliness. On February the 13th, 1981, 48 daughters and sons, husbands and wives, mothers and fathers, cousins and in-laws, uncles and aunts, neighbours, friends and co-workers went out to the Stardust on the night of the dancing competition and never came home. For their families, in the nightmare that was to follow, their loved ones not only lost their lives, they lost their identities. They were much, much more than numbers. They were bright, beautiful people. They had plans. They had dreams. They had their whole lives ahead of them. Today, as their families did in their pen portraits to the Stardust inquest, we remember each of them. Michael Barrett, who was working that night as an assistant DJ. He was wise beyond his years. He had an infectious laugh. He was 17 years old. Richard Bennett, who loved the horses and took on the role of breadwinner for his family, described as an angel in disguise. He was 17. Carol Bissett, a singer in the choir, a girl guide, quiet in her ways, much loved by all. She was 18. Jimmy Buckley, the life of every party, who loved hurling and had won a competition for his Elvis impression. Father figure, brother, hero. He was 23. Paula Byrne, always the peacemaker. She loved to draw, was the epitome of kindness. She was 19. Caroline Carey, a talented Irish dancer who took up disco dancing. A Dublin City Council clerical officer who'd recently found out she was going to be a mother. Her family asked me to tell this house today that this baby was the 49th victim of the Stardust tragedy. Caroline was 17. John Colgan, Johnny, always upbeat. He lit up every room and performed the Hucklebuck as his party piece. He was going to be an uncle. He was 21. Jacqueline Croker, a heart of gold who brought music into her family's lives on her red record player and used her wages to dress and treat her brothers and sisters. She was 18. Liam Dunn, training to be a butcher, which he loved, with a passion for music. He was a loving boy with many friends. He was 18. Michael Farrell, his family's bundle of joy. He worked at Cadbury, a dapper young man who always tried to look his best. He was a deep thinker, a diarist. He was 26. Michael French, horsey, an auto electrician, and the rock of his family, a role model who worked hard to share his wages and thought of everyone else before himself. He was 18. David Flood, a rocker at heart who loved the guitar and was known for his Jagger swagger. He never missed a day of work and he had all of life's possibilities ahead of him. He was 18. Thelma Fraser, gentle, kind, loved Friday nights and disco moves, remembered by her brothers and her sisters for her treats, her hugs, her kisses. She was 20. Josephine Glenn, quiet, gentle, always smiling and happy. A second mam to her brothers and sisters. She left school to help support her family. She was 16. Michael Griffiths, happy, outgoing, with a great work ethic and a generous nature. He loved family occasions. He loved Christmas and could always be heard laughing, singing, playing music. He was 18. Robert Hillock, Bobby, outgoing, hard-working. He loved football and boxing. He was very close to his late brother Bill. He was 20. Brian Hobbs, his sister was known as his mammy Pat. He was academically inclined. He excelled at catering college, winning a gold medal for Ireland in competition. He was ambitious. He was going places. He was 21. Eugene, Hughie Hogan, a skilled carpenter, a sharp dresser with a beautiful voice who could hit the high notes, a loving, caring father. He was 24. Murta Kavanagh, caring, kind, good-natured. He was a heating insulator who looked after his father. He loved the Dubs and Man United. He was 27. Martina Keegan, not just a daughter and a sister, but a best friend and a confidant. She dreamed of being a model. She was studious and hard-working. She was 16. Mary Keegan, beautiful inside and out, shy at heart, but very fun-loving and sociable, a teacher to her younger siblings. She excelled at school and work. She was 19. Robert Kelly, nicknamed Spiky for his hairstyle. He worked on the B&I boats and loved it. He was a lover of music and embroidery. He was 17. Mary Kennedy, warm, caring, lively and fiercely protective, dancing as soon as she could walk. Her personality and her style were as bright as her smile. She was 17. Mary Kenny, popular, kind, funny, passionate about fashion and dancing, a fan of Leeds United. She'd just turned 19. Margaret Kiernan, a friend to all who loved sport and loved socialising, loved to sing Roxanne, and who dreamt of a happy future in a house next door to her best friend Deirdre. She was 18. Sandra Lawless, happy, kind, funny, selfless, a Girl Guide leader, a swimmer who won awards for life-saving. She loved hiking and camping in the Dublin mountains. She was 18. Francis Lawler, an army man with a love of style. He'd great leadership skills and he never liked to leave his beautiful baby Lisa. He was 25. Maureen Lawler, a loving and devoted mother to Lisa. Full of dreams for the future, she shared an interest in fashion with her husband Francis. Was always immaculately dressed. She was 26. Paula Lewis was her mother's right-hand woman and her father's pride and joy. She was a second mother to her siblings and her little sister's roommate. She was 19. Eamon Lockman, a protector of his brothers and sisters who remember the crossbars on his racer, a car enthusiast, a music lover with a deep laugh. He was 18. Donna Mahon, a lovely person who loved her job working in the newsagents, meeting people and being part of the community. She had plans to go to Santa Ponsa for her 18th birthday. She was 17. Helena Mangan, kind, caring, loving, brave, strong. Her daughter Samantha was the centre of her life. She loved to dance. She was 22. George McDermott, a gentle music lover with a cheeky grin. He loved a bop and playing cards with his pals. He was 18. Marcella McDermott, happy, singing and dancing with the most gentle and kind nature, especially with children. She was 16. William McDermott, Willie, a gentle giant with a beautiful smile, soft-voiced, witty, caring, kind. He loved the weekend, the Dubliners, and being on Hill 16. He was 22. Julie MacDonald, caring, helpful, thoughtful, a hard worker and provider. She loved football. She coached a local team. She was mad for Elvis. She was 20. Teresa MacDonald, the focal point of her family. She was brave. She stood up for what she believed in, and she loved all animals. She was 16. Gerard McGrath, independent and full of energy, talented with his hands, a dapper music lover. He had a passion for the natural world and a love of birds. He was 21. Caroline McHugh, an avid reader, Irish dancer, swimmer, a member of the local CB radio club who did well in school and work. She was 17. James Miller, a sailor who travelled the world, so happy to be engaged, to be married and ready to settle down and raise his family. He was 20. Susan Morgan, a tomboy who loved football and walks in Dublin. She was bubbly, she was funny, she was full of life. She was 19. David Morton, football mad and named Chesty for preferring to receive the ball there than have it mess up his hair. He was mischievous, he was charismatic, he was independent, and he had big dreams for the future. He was 19. Kathleen Muldoon, good-natured, thoughtful. She wanted to be a nurse and cared for all those around her. She was 19. George O'Connor, a gentle homebody with a creative spirit. He loved science fiction. He was attending his very first dance. He was 17. Brendan O'Mara, talented Irish dancer and sportsman. He'd help anyone out in any way he could and never had a hair out of place. He was 23. John Stout, sensitive, gentle, also an Elvis fan. He likes snooker. He planned to become a painter and decorator to contribute to the family household that he loved. He was 18. Margaret Thornton, a lover of fashion, music, skilled in dressmaking and tailoring. She loved the pictures, concerts, and especially discos. She was 19. Paul Wade, a people person, good at chatting. He made friends easily, someone you simply couldn't stay mad at. He was 17. Today, as Cian Corla, we think as well of the hundreds of people who were injured and who were scarred forever, physically and mentally, scarred by fire and scarred by survival. We think of the people working in the Stardust, the waiters, the waitresses, the doormen, the DJs. We think of the frontline workers who fought to save lives on the night, the fire crews, the ambulance and hospital staff, the Gardaí, the army, the taxi drivers. And I want to acknowledge those who came forward many years later and told their stories at the inquest. I want to acknowledge the Dublin communities who were good neighbours to the Stardust families and communities right across Ireland who supported them for 43 years. 43 years since the momentous, devastating loss that was experienced in those early hours of Valentine's Day, 1981. Families who had last seen their loved ones getting dressed up in their best, freshly pressed outfits, getting ready to meet friends, going out for a dance, suddenly hearing of a fire in the Stardust, or the sound of sirens, or the knock on the door. And then the escalating panic as the realisation dawned that a disaster was unfolding, to the desperation of searching, of hoping, of praying that your family member or friend had left, had escaped, somehow wasn't there when the fire started and spread, to the frantic grounds of the Stardust car park, the hospitals and the morgue, to the dismay of confirming the identity of lost loved ones by recognising melted jewellery, or an engagement ring, or a wedding ring, clothing, or a digital watch, with a loved one's name replaced by a number, or that dreaded label, unidentified, or waiting many years for confirmation of identity, long after the agonising pain of loss, and the dreadful aftermath, the body bags, the numbers, the rushed funerals, the closed coffins, the shattering of families, every subsequent event marred and scarred, tainted and tarnished. Their surviving children whose rearing years were done through a sea of tears. Mothers afraid to hug, afraid to love, in fear of losing another child. Broken hearts, broken lives, broken marriages. Being accused of telling lies, the smear of arson attached to their loved ones, having their grief and their sadness misconstrued as madness, a sense of threat and suppression when they simply started looking for answers. Stigma heaped upon sorrow bred shame and silence, the intergenerational and communal ripple effect of so much agony and the lack of closure. The families gathered here today and their loved ones who perished, the family members who are no longer with us, and all those who suffered horrific injuries were the victims of a mass tragedy. In such shattering circumstances, the most basic expectation must surely be that the state comes to the aid of its citizens and supports them in the terrible aftermath. Instead, it is to our great and eternal shame that far from the warm embrace of a caring state, the Stardust families experienced a cold shoulder, a deaf ear, and 2 generations of struggle for truth and justice. Instead, it is to our great shame that state processes heaped misery upon tragedy for the Stardust families. I am so deeply sorry that your first bid for justice ended with suspicion being cast on those who had died or survived on that catastrophic night. With your pain and your grief compounded by stigma and rejection, families were forced to fight for decades to obtain the vindication that you won last Thursday when the inquest returned a verdict of unlawful killing in the case of your 48 family members. For all of this, as Taoiseach, on behalf of this state, I apologise unreservedly to all the families of the Stardust victims and all the survivors for the hurt that was done to them and for the profoundly painful years of struggle for the truth. I apologise to the families that those present on the night of the fire were wrongly criminalised through the allegation of arson, which was an attack on their reputations. I say today clearly in Dáil Éireann, every person there was innocent. I say today the truth is now known, and I say today not only were they innocent, they were unlawfully killed. The government accepts the findings of the coroner's court. The government accepts the recommendations of the jury. This was formally noted at our cabinet meeting this morning, and the Minister for Justice and other relevant ministers have been asked to report back on the implementation of its recommendations. I've asked my own department to prepare proposals to appropriately commemorate the disaster as requested by the families, and I look forward to engaging with and agreeing a way forward with the families on this. Last Saturday, when I met with you here in government buildings, I listened to the pain, the grief, and the righteous anger. It is beyond comprehension how, in the midst of horrific suffering, you found the endurance and the fortitude to form the Stardust Victims Committee and start your long, long fight. But that moment has led to this one. This moment where we say, your loved ones are no longer lost in the smoke and the dark and the fire, but are brought back into the light, where we fulfil the promise of the proclamation of our republic and say without question, they are our cherished children. I want to pay tribute to 3 of the women who sat in that cold hush outside government buildings 15 years ago who are here with us today. Gertrude Barrett, Antoinette Keegan and Bridget McDermott. Their incredible spirit in refusing to be kept out in the cold helped lead us to this moment today. However, very sadly, a 4th woman who was there, Christine Keegan, and her late husband John didn't live to see this day. I want to turn to the words of Christine and the questions that she asked, which was never answered in her lifetime. Christine said in a statement she prepared for the inquest, but that she never got to deliver, "The Stardust fire took all our happy family days away from us. It took away all our belief in faith, and it took away our trust with successive governments over the years. We felt abandoned and all alone and left like lambs to a slaughter. Everything brushed under the carpet to keep the truth hidden." I would like to ask a question to the government, the establishment and its agencies. What did we families of the deceased victims of the Stardust fire ever do on the government to deserve this ill treatment and constant systemic abuse that we have sustained for the past 38 years? Today I want to answer that question. You did nothing wrong. The institutions of this state failed you. The institutions of this state let you down. These brave families should never have had to walk alone. We should have been by your side. We should have walked with you. We did not. And for that, we are truly sorry. We should have offered counselling. We should have provided answers. We should have ensured that the truth came out. As Christy Moore recognised in his powerful song about the tragedy, the victims waited in vain, except it wasn't for 4 years. It was for 43. Today, we honour the 48 children who never came home. Today, we apologise to the families, to the survivors, to those who were denied the truth for too long. I want to thank the inquest jury for delivering a just verdict last Thursday. I want to thank the senior coroner, Dr. Myra Cullinan, for her sensitive and meticulous conduct of the inquest. The terrible reality is that we will never know for certain how many lives were ended by this tragedy. Beyond the 48 whose names we know, there were countless others whose lives were turned to ash on that terrible, terrible night. Their hopes and their dreams were destroyed twice over. First by the fire, and then by successive failures of this state to do what was right. And for that, I am truly sorry.
Antara Eamon Ryan.
Thank you, Ascan Corla. Thank you, Taoiseach. This is an incredible, important day for the families who lost loved ones in the Stardust fire. But I'm conscious that any sense of relief today's apology may bring is tempered by the fact that they had to wait for far, far too long to hear it. Most of us in this chamber know what it's like to lose a family member, but few of us will have experienced the devastation of losing a loved one in such terrible circumstances. The fact that this pain was compounded by the state's unwillingness to correct the glaring flaws of those original investigations for so long is impossible to justify by anyone here today. The organs of the Irish state didn't respond when repeatedly confronted by contradictory evidence. It's a sobering indictment of our integrity as a nation, and one that we must reflect upon, uncomfortable though it may be for many of us in most powerful positions. I've spent some time since the verdict was announced last week going back over the pen portraits of the victims that have been read out by their families during the inquest's opening weeks. Reading about so many young lives cut short just as they were entering their prime is incredibly poignant. No one who died in that fire was over the age of 27. In fact, the vast majority were in their late teens or early 20s. I was 17 when that fire took place, and I remember the shock that spread over Dublin, the pall, the gloom that Sunday, and then on Monday morning going to school trying to make sense of what had happened. The fondness and affection with which the families talk about those they lost is both touching and heartbreaking. Young people finding love or seeking adventure, boyfriends and girlfriends with dreams of settling down and raising families of their own, fans of football and fashion, some who might have loved the Rolling Stones, others Dolly Parton or Diana Ross. Young people generously sharing their pay with their parents to help their families through tough times. The portrait that Thelma Fraser's family gave the inquest would stay with you. And I hope and trust they won't mind me sharing some of it just as an example with you now, so as I think it illustrates the incredible sense of loss that all the families have experienced. Barbara Fraser was just 6 years old when she watched her big sister do her hair and makeup and pick up her clothes ahead of the Valentine's disco. Growing up in a house full of boys in Ringsend, the two sisters shared a bed in the family's box room, despite the 14-year-old age difference between them. Thelma had hugged her little sister Barbara that night, given her a kiss and tucked her into bed before she headed to Artane. The next morning, her father woke her frantically, shouting at her if she knew where Thelma was. That was the night, she said, they stole my sister, that stole my happy family, that stole my childhood. Barbara told the inquest. The big sister, who Barbara had idolised, wasn't there when she made her first Holy Communion a year later, nor at any of the other life's events that form such important markers in a young person's life. In my teens for advice, as she said, my big sister should have been there. In my preparations for my wedding, my sister should have been there. When I had my daughter, my sister should have been there. Thelma's brother Morris recalled how the house went from being a happy home full of life and laughter to just a house. Everyone could and should, I'd urge, read the portraits themselves if they haven't already. Many of the families knew deep down that the official account of how their children had died wasn't right. The original tribunal had certainly given the impression of thoroughness, sitting for 122 days, hearing from more than 350 witnesses. But the conclusions it reached were clearly flawed. Despite unearthing no evidence to indicate that the fire was started deliberately, it nevertheless concluded that the most probable explanation was that it was the result of arson. We've witnessed this blaming of victims before, and I'm not the first to note the awful similarity to the Hillsborough Stadium disaster, where another devastated community was left to battle the authorities for decades in order to get justice. And just as with the Hillsborough campaign, the Stardust families were forced to call on every possible reserve of resilience and determination so as to force a disinterested state to listen. Just as with Hillsborough, the families eventually succeeded in getting an order for new inquests to be held, with the Attorney General accepting their argument that the original inquest had been too narrowly focused on the medical cause of their loved ones' deaths and not enough on the wider circumstances behind them. Last week, the families got their answer, the answer that they had known for decades, but were continually denied by the state, that their loved ones had been unlawfully killed. The families have every right to be angry at the state which denied them that truth for so long. What further compounds the sense of tragedy is that it was so avoidable if only proper fire, health and safety rules had been followed. Now, we might be tempted to look back at the early 80s as an almost backward time compared to now, but rules and responsibilities around fire safety were well established. The Stardust nightclub was also known not to be following them. A Dublin Corporation planning official had identified that the wrong type of tile was being used on the nightclub's walls, but it felt it was up to the fire brigades to object and not his. Numerous complaints have been made by a corporation inspector about the venue's exits being blocked, and yet it continued to operate. Just 2 weeks before the fire, the corporation had complained to Patrick Butterley that exits had been blocked during a packed concert at the venue. Assurances were given, but not honoured. It's right that the Taoiseach has offered you, the relatives, a full state apology today. It is one you have waited far too long for. As W.B. Yeats famously wrote, that too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. But the pen portraits that were so lovingly composed show that that is not the case for you. Your sacrifice has undoubtedly been for too long, but the love and affection you continue to hold in your hearts for the sons, daughters, mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, aunts and uncles you have lost is undeniable. I'd like to conclude Las Concorla by quoting another of the pen portraits, this time but from Michael French, as recounted by his sister Caroline. She recalled how Michael would take his young siblings to St Anne's Park on the crossbar, the yellow racer he made himself, or dance around the kitchen with his mother when she needed cheering up. His dream, she said, was to make life a little easier for his mother. Michael was a legend. He was our big brother and our rock, she recalled. Young lives, cut short, but the cherished memories remained. You, their loved ones, have kept those memories alive. You are an example of all that is good in our country. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Bogarai and Tara Darrow O'Brien.
And I too join in the welcome to the families who are here today, and I wish to join the Taoiseach, the government, and I believe all of us who are privileged enough to sit in this House in issuing a full and unreserved state apology. And it is right and fitting for this chamber to offer, however late in the day, whatever solace we can. Like so many others, I remember that day. I was only 6 years old at the time, but I had 3 teenage sisters. And in North Dublin, the Stardust was one of the main places to go. I can still remember not fully understanding at the time what happened, or indeed the scale of it, but knowing my parents were extremely quiet, my community were. Their worst nightmare had been visited upon 48 other families. In responding to the Stardust tragedy, our state did not live up to the principles of justice, its core values, nor on the decency that we owe every person. The victims, their families, their friends, and their community were let down. The failure, and this failure, is a matter of deep and lasting regret and shame for our state and all of us who represent it. The state response was utterly lacking in compassion and understanding. And even worse, it compounded the trauma with grievous mistakes, the baseless findings of probable arson that cast scurrilous aspersions of guilt on an entire community, the paucity and the complexity of the state compensation, the sheer amount of time it has taken us to get to today's apology, a process wrung out through gimlet eyes of a system blind to suffering. We owed all of you so much more. The depth of this tragedy is still so hard to fathom. Red flame and black smoke engulfing a heaving club, knocks on parents' doors in the dead of night, desperate phone calls, and the red-eyed visits to the city morgue at Store Street. It was a moment of despair that stretches across decades and stretches across the generations. A nation cast in gloom with shock, whole communities silenced and quietened for years. In the face of such horror, there were also stories of courage and compassion. The Dublin Fire Brigade personnel who made their way through the thicket of darkness and smoke, running into danger against every instinct except bravery. Gardaí who arrived at a scene of chaos and helped where they could, ultimately carrying the victims and survivors out of the ashes to worried and grieving families. Medical staff who fought desperately to save as many as they could. The trace of smoke heavy in the wards. Taxi drivers, neighbours, the community who helped the survivors. The religious communities who put the victims to rest in the days and weeks afterwards, offering what comfort they could across multiple funerals a day. The bravery, compassion and commitment of those men and women speaks to the best of us during the worst of our moments. For many, that night has never left them. They grappled with the bleak memories, bereft of support, other than the support of each other. The searing scale of the tragedy has not dimmed over time. The sundering of families, the unfinished lives, the incomplete stories, the paths closed forever can never be healed. The grief cut deep and it endures still. Its sharpness is felt and carried every single day. The families and friends gathered here today in the gallery and watching are a living tribute to those who passed. We can only but imagine the toll you have paid to keep their memories alive and to pursue justice over the decades without the support of this state. Added to that weight, and the family members who have passed in the years since, under a dark pall of injustice and grief. The matter never, ever settled for them. Questions were left open. The survivors have taken on their burden as well. We all risk being overwhelmed by the worst events in our lives, to be buried by the sheer scale of a tragedy. And it is a testament to the courage and to the convictions of the family and of all of the families that they refuse to be. Time and time again, they refuse to be knocked down by indifference and took up their cause anew. Your dignity and your grace is humbling. And I hope this moment offers some small measure of solace and vindication, a long-awaited measure of justice for you, for your families, for your friends, for your community. Today is not the end. There is a pressing moral demand for further steps now. The inquest's recommendations on building standards and inspections need to be implemented, and they will be. They will be done so in full and in full consultation with the families, because this never can be allowed to happen again. A fitting memorial and engagement with the families, survivors, local schools and communities will be needed to ensure that night is always remembered by generations to come. And I want to commit to working with families directly to address what the next steps need to be taken. Justice demands not just words, but deeds. Your voice has to be the beating heart of that process. Today is a moment for the families whose lives have been changed and shattered forever. For the tightly knit, hard-working communities of North Dublin where the streets went silent. For those touched by the terrible events who were never the same again when they escaped the smoke and the flames. For those who never got out in the cold air of the early hours of February the 14th, 1981. Their names are in the record for time immemorial, and let us all remember them. A St. Valentine's weekend, brimful of excitement and possibility. Competition night in the Stardust. Pleading with parents for permission to go out. Blondie blasting on the radio as they jostle with brothers and sisters. Lipstick applied carefully and a new blade for every sharp shave. Black boot polish out, dancing shoes at the ready. Freshly pressed shirts and bright dresses. The usual row over borrowed clothes. A tie grab from the dad's wardrobe for the boys to get past the bouncers. A few bobs scraped together from the week folded into the wallet. A last glance in the mirror and leaping down the stairs with a fleeting goodbye as the cold night opens to them. The whiff of perfume and aftershave caught in the air when the door shuts behind them. The full bloom of youth, futures stretched ahead to a bright horizon. They never came home, but they are vindicated now. Their families are vindicated. We failed them, and we are truly sorry.
Richard Bruton.
Thank you very much, Ashkan Corda. I think, as the three ministers have said, this has been a tragedy of harrowing proportions for the families. A Valentine's night that turned to anguish. You can only imagine the panic of people experiencing the chains and padlocks blocking their exit and the lights failing in the darkness as that tragedy ensued. I think the initial determination of arson was seen as a further slap in the face to the families and to the victims themselves. The burning sense of injustice has fired these families throughout a very long struggle, and we who have represented them in the constituency have failed them, and I acknowledge that fully. Often it seems that the chains and the padlocks were being again put in place as they sought to find justice from a system that always seemed to have the doors closed. Your anger and frustration with politicians and with the system is amply justified. Even though the record of arson was overturned, you did not know the truth. And it is with great sorrow that we realise that at long last we've had to acknowledge the failings that have brought us to this day. I acknowledge the fortitude and the determination of the families, which is an example to us all. And I join wholeheartedly in the apology issued by the Taoiseach and the two ministers.
Thank you, Laskin Corda. This is a very historic day, but it's also a very emotional one for the families of the victims and for the survivors of the Stardust tragedy. The fire in the Stardust nightclub in Artane in February 1981 was truly horrific. 48 young lives were lost and over 200 were injured. Since that night, the families have campaigned tirelessly to establish what exactly happened and to determine the cause of the fire, to get justice and the truth for their loved ones. As a teenager, I once attended the Stardust for a ballot session. Following my election to Dublin City Council in 1985 for Artane, I was happy to work with the Stardust Victims Committee, particularly with the late Christine Keegan, who was a wonderful woman. They actively pursued a number of issues, including various planning applications in respect of the Butterley Business Park and the provision of a Stardust Memorial Park in Bonnybrook. The history of the 43-year-long campaign to get justice and the truth is well documented. But I would like to focus a little on the 1982 Keene Tribunal report. While it did some good work in making recommendations to ensure that such a fire never happened again, a key demand of the Stardust Victims Committee, its finding that the cause of the fire was probably arson was incredibly insensitive and was very wrong. The Ireland of the early 80s was a very different place to what it is today. We had a hierarchical society. The Kerry Babies Tribunal is also evidence of this. But even by the standards of that time, the finding was appalling. For my own part, I genuinely believe that I consistently followed up any issues the committee asked me to do. I raised various matters in the Dáil. I wrote to the relevant ministers as requested. But if I'm honest, though, this was not enough. I also admit that my relations with the committee were at times fraught, and I do regret that. I admit, too, that when Pat McCartan issued his finding in 2017 to the effect that no new inquiry was warranted, I could not see how the case could be advanced further. So the decision to seek new inquests was an inspired one. And I am in awe of the persistence of the families at that dark time to continue the fight. And they did so with determination and great dignity. But we can go into all these matters at another time. Today, the families have got the long overdue state apology. That the state failed them is clearly evident, and they have every right to be angry about what happened. In due course, attention can be given to other issues that now need to be attended to. Planning for a suitable state commemoration for all those who died should now be commenced in consultation with the families. Today, we remember in a very special way the 48 victims of the Stardust fire, and I hope that the state apology from the Taoiseach, which we've just heard, will bring some closure for the families and restore the identity and dignity of all those who perished in the terrible fire on St. Valentine's Day in 1981.
And I too welcome the state apology today, and it's necessary and very long overdue. Like TDs, I want to welcome all the families here today. I hope last week's verdict of unlawful killing gives some degree of comfort and vindication to the families for the terrible loss they've suffered. I hope the inquest has provided some solace about what happened the night of the families who endured and continue to endure enormous suffering. This suffering was compounded by the state's treatment of the victims and their families over the past 43 years. The Stardust fire, Valentine's Day 1981, was a national tragedy and left legacy of pain for families, the community and indeed the people of Dublin. As the youngest of a large family myself, I remember it being discussed as I grew up, but it was only when the inquest commenced that we really moved beyond the event and learned about the 48, or as the Taoiseach acknowledged, 49 young people that lost their lives that fatal night. As the Taoiseach also highlighted, the pen portraits aspect of the inquest was a very important step. It gave the bereaved families an opportunity to describe and celebrate the lives of their loved ones. While the conclusion of the inquiry and today's state apology will not bring back those lost, they are important steps on the road for justice for the 48 families, one they have been fighting for over 40 years. I welcome the Tanaiste's remarks earlier that the state must follow on through on the commitments and remaining steps. This must be done in consultation with the families. They must be at the centre of that process. I hope the verdict in today's state apology will bring some peace for the bereaved families and all those impacted by this terrible loss. And we recall and we pray for those who have passed away without witnessing today's momentous occasion, for those who have fought for the victims of this tragedy for so long. Gurmí Lamaka.
agus in isisi seachta John Lahart.
So my role in this was quite small, quite minor, but I would like to speak just to illustrate how hard the families worked on this. I was appointed Dublin spokesperson for my party in 2016, and as a Dublin spokesperson, I, along with the colleagues who had preceded me in that role, it fell to me to meet the families, which I did on a number of occasions, along with my party leader, Micheál Martin, at the time, who was leader of the opposition. I found it, I suppose I was sent in to bat and found that I had very little to bat with. Parliamentary questions, all the efforts made by both myself, by many members of the opposition, by predecessors who had held the position I held, seemed to be met with silence, and it became more and more frustrating meeting the families. So it was then with a great sense of surprise initially and shock, but huge delight, when I woke one morning to learn that the Attorney General at the time, Seamus Wolfe, who deserves huge commendation in this entire process, decided, against the backdrop of decades of denial, that an inquest ought to take place. And that inquest has taken place, and the verdict has been delivered, and the Taoiseach and the ministers have spoken very eloquently. I did try to place myself on the way into the Dáil today, into the shoes of the parents and grandparents and siblings of the victims, to try and see exactly what they may be feeling coming into Dáil Éireann today. And I hope they feel some enormous sense of vindication. Fatigue, I imagine, is one of the overriding feelings that they have experienced. But the one thing I suppose I have learned as a very minor political player at the time, and I offer my apologies to Antoinette, who I met several times, and other family members, is that behind every minister are officials. And officials very often provide the official answers that the minister delivers. And that is one of the most frustrating things that I found. But again, politics after 4 decades worked when an Attorney General of the country stood up and said, actually, it's way beyond time. An inquest ought to be held. An inquest will be held. Thanks, Lascan.
Agus in isisi Sinn Féin seachta Mary Lou MacDonald.
Gurmagat Las Ceann Comhairle. For young Dubliners in the late 70s and early 80s, the Stardust Ballroom was the place to be. It was a huge venue that hosted cabarets, concerts and discos at the weekend. Such was its popularity that you could get a bus from the quays in the city centre directly to the nightclub in Artane. With 3 bars, a stage and a large dance floor, it was a wonderland for nighttime revellers. At capacity, it held close to 1,500 people. It was a gold mine. It hosted names such as Joe Dolan, Dickie Rock, Cliff Richard, the iconic Thin Lizzy, and even U2. So young people would flock there to sing and dance their hearts out, to forget the cares of the world and to have the crack with their friends. For a generation, the Stardust Ballroom was a place of excitement, fun, and the endless possibilities of a night out. On the 13th of February 1981, hundreds of young people headed to the Stardust for a Valentine's dance. And they would have done all of the things that young people do getting ready for a big night out. Blared the music in their bedrooms, picked out the clothes to look their best, got the hair just right, and made sure that they had enough money in their pockets so the night would be all that it could. It was a Friday night in Dublin, a Valentine's weekend. They were young and full of life, and the world was their oyster. And as they hurried out their front doors, you can imagine their casual farewells. See you in the morning. Don't be worrying. Yes, I have a key. Leave the light on so I let myself in later. Don't wait up. Love you, Ma. Love you, Dad. For 48 of these young people, this was the last time they would say goodbye to their mother, their father, and their family, and they didn't know it. These 48 young people, so full of life, so full of love, went out to enjoy a dance, and they never came home. The Stardust was busy that night. A big attraction was the dance competition, which was won by Errol Buckley. His brother Jimmy, bursting with pride, jumped up on the stage to hug him when his name was announced. It was the last happy moment they'd have together. A little after 1:30 a.m, a fire was spotted in the west alcove of the ballroom. What initially appeared to be a manageable fire quickly escalated out of control. Staff tried to tackle the blaze with fire extinguishers, but to no avail. It spread at a terrifying pace throughout the club, fueled by the PVC-coated polyester fabric on the seating and the highly flammable carpet tiles on the walls. Survivors recalled the inferno looking like a monster, a living thing coming after you with a frightening ferocity. As the heat rose and the fire spread, confusion reigned for people who had no time to grasp the horrifying scene that engulfed them. The fire melted material on the ceiling which dripped onto the crowd, and a huge cloud of thick, black, poisonous smoke enveloped everyone. People collapsed because they simply could not breathe. And then a massive bang. The lighting in the nightclub failed. Darkness, mass panic. People rushed towards the exit in a desperate bid to escape. The section of the crowd that rushed for the main exit were carried along in a crushing sea of desperation. Only one door of the main exit was open, the other had to be kicked open. Some people lost their footing as they reached for air and for escape. Antoinette Keegan, whose sisters Martina and Mary were killed in the fire, said, "I was on the ground. I couldn't get up with my sisters. We were all holding one another's hands. It was just like a fireball that came down and it was coming towards us. I remember putting my hands over my head. My last words I remember ever saying in there before I lost consciousness was, 'Oh God, help us.' Those who tried to escape through the fire exits found them chained and padlocked shut. Windows were blocked with metal grills and steel plates, making escape impossible. Those who ran into the toilets remained trapped inside the nightclub, even as people outside tried to help them get out. They tried to remove the metal grills with sledgehammers and axes, but they would not budge. Firefighters who first arrived at the scene at 1:49 a.m, tried to pull them down with the chain attached to a fire engine, but they would not budge. Many of those trapped inside ran back in the direction of the blaze and smothering black smoke. They couldn't find an escape route. Time ran out. In less than half an hour, the fire had ripped through the entire ballroom, and then the screams inside stopped. Silence. As Artane and the city of Dublin slept its way into Valentine's Day, innocence died with those young lives taken in the Stardust, with those young people so brutally injured in the Stardust. The news of the fire and fatalities had spread through the early morning. Families gathered at the local Garda station, desperately seeking information about their loved ones. They were told to get the bus to the hospital or the morgue. This callousness set the tone for the 43 years of disrespect and contempt these families would face. Families waited and waited for news. Waited and waited for their loved ones to be identified. They waited in pain and agony for days. The families of 5 victims would have to wait until 2007 for their loved ones to be identified. Some families were handed a body bag with just a number tag. They were given no say on the graveyard in which their loved ones were buried, no say in the choice of undertaker, no support, no counselling. Traumatised families had to rely on each other for comfort and help. And as the families suffered this cruelty, the big lie was already in motion, spreading as fast as the fire itself. The big lie that the Stardust fire was caused by arson. The nation's newspapers' headlines screamed arson. It was a lie repeated over and over. It smeared, it criminalised the victims and survivors, suggesting that one of their number was responsible. It was a lie that devastated families and further traumatised survivors. And to this day, Lascown Corla, to this day, those families and survivors still ask, who crafted that lie? Who spun it? Who spread it? And why? What was their motive? And who were they protecting? 43 years on, and they still don't have the answer to those questions. In November 1981, the original tribunal, presided over by Justice Ronan Keane, concluded that the fire was probably caused by arson. The big lie then became the state's official position. One survivor described to me her experience of that tribunal as aggressive and hostile, how she was cross-examined by 8 different barristers, how she felt bullied and intimidated. She, Lascown Corla, was a traumatised survivor of the Stardust Inferno, and she was 18 years old. The arson lie would remain on the public record for decades. And if the Keane Tribunal compounded the arson lie, well then the compensation scheme that followed compounded the state's utter contempt for the families. Families were forced to sign non-disclosure agreements. Families were threatened that they would lose their home and be cast into poverty if they sought an independent legal route. This is how the state behaved towards families who had suffered enormous loss and incalculable grief. The lives of victims' families were literally destroyed by the Stardust fire. Destroyed lives of mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, friends, and a child. Gertrude Barrett, the mother of Michael Barrett, who was 17 when he was killed in the Stardust, I think powerfully summed up the impact on her family and others. Like a tornado, she said, the Stardust fire ripped through the core of our beings, wreaking havoc and utter devastation in its wake, leaving nothing untouched. Be it our home, our lives, our relationships, our education, our future, our outlook on life, in fact, our everything. Nothing was ever the same again and changed forever as we knew it. I had only 17 and a half years of normality or regular family life. My youngest son had 10 years, my middle son had 14, and my daughter had 16 years. And no matter how long my children live, their lives as they knew it ended at ages 10, 14, and 16. The rest of their rearing years were done through a sea of tears, unimaginable grief, sadness, sorrow, and an untold amount of emotional pain. Others have spoken so bravely of family members falling into addiction, depression, illness and health complications because they simply could not cope with the weight of the grief and loss. And so many parents went to their graves without having the truth about the deaths of their child acknowledged. They died without the comfort of vindication. And yet, incredibly, the families kept going. The seeds of this extraordinary resilience were planted by John Keegan, who established the Stardust Victims Committee in 1985. John would die the following year. On the same day, he lost a Supreme Court case for personal injuries from the deaths of his daughters Mary and Martina in the Stardust. The ruling stood in sharp contrast to the more than £500,000 in legal compensation paid to the owner of the Stardust following the original tribunal. One law for the rich, another for ordinary people, a tale as old as time that still holds true today. For decades, the families and campaign pushed for a new inquiry and were obstructed by the state every step of the way. Instead of backing and delivering a new inquiry, governments continued to circle the wagons. In 2007, families were forced to withdraw from a government-established review of new information because the chair, John Gallagher SC, had represented Gardaí at the original tribunal. It is still mind-blowing that this would happen in the first place. In 2009, when the Coffey Review finally ruled that there was no evidence that the fire was caused by arson, still even then government refused to establish a new inquiry. Truth and justice swept under the carpet. In 2017, following a review of new evidence compiled by the families, Justice Pat McCartan failed to recommend a new inquiry. After 36 years of fighting for truth and justice, no new inquiry was again the response of the state to people it should have moved heaven and earth to vindicate. And yet a year later, a chink of hope cut through the darkness. The families discovered new evidence with which to petition the Attorney General for a new inquest. In 2019, following a submission made on behalf of the families by Phoenix Law, the then Attorney General Seamus Wolfe announced that a new inquest would be held into the Stardust fire. The light at the end of a very dark, long tunnel grew brighter, but once again the contempt of the state towards the families came to the surface. After 43 years of struggle, the state had attempted to exclude elderly parents of victims from access to legal support and to that very inquest. Families had to fight to ensure that inquest jurors were selected in a transparent way and so that jurors would have their incomes protected. More obstruction, more disrespect, more contempt. Behaviours, consistent behaviours that spanned more than 4 decades. At each and every turn, the state abused its power to bully, intimidate, pressure and coerce heartbroken mothers, grieving fathers and devastated families. Instead of the state standing shoulder to shoulder with the Stardust families, they lined up against them again and again and again. The state placed so little or no value on the lives of 48 working-class young people whose lives were snuffed out in the Stardust ballroom. To the powerful, these young people and their families didn't matter, and that's the cold, hard truth. This travesty happened on the watch of successive governments, successive Taoiseach and successive ministers for justice. The hope of government was that the families would eventually stop, eventually shut up, eventually give up, and eventually go away. Well, those governments forgot one very important thing. You don't mess with Dublin Mas. You don't mess with Dublin Dads. You don't mess with Irish mammies and daddies and families, not when they're fighting for justice for their children, because you will lose and they will win. Even if it takes them 43 long years, they will win. When they know they have right on their side, ordinary people keep going. And that's a lesson that those in power would do very well to remember. So today, finally, the state apologises for all of it, because the families of the Stardust victims didn't stop. They didn't shut up. They didn't give up. They didn't go away. They are here today in the public gallery of the Dáil, and they are here in victory. And I want to say this to you. To the ordinary people of Ireland, your loved ones always mattered. The ordinary people of Ireland were always on your side, always had your backs, mourned with you, shed tears with you. They saw your suffering and they never abandoned you. They never forgot what you had lost. The late lamented and indomitable Charlie Bird told your story with passion and grace, and he supported you every step of the way. Our great national bard, Christy Moore, penned and sang your soft, beautiful anthem for justice. It called out the powerful and it named the crocodile tears. And They Never Came Home has rung out powerfully wherever people gather for a sing-song now, and it always will. The inspiration you provided for over 40 years and the solidarity of the people, that sense of community, that's the real Ireland, not the bitter contempt inflicted upon you by those who should have upheld your rights. In you Fuyera, Gawan an Stot Aleshke le Chowli Nanini Moroi, Gnav Glahak Satina Stardust, Agus Lo Shud a Honig Slán. Fag Tri Blina is Dahad, Curran Stot, Agus Realtis Inia Kayla Bakriv, Shiv Gakila or Agrina Shiv Kincha, Gerhonig on Irina Consulis. When the verdict came through last Thursday, it confirmed what the people of Ireland already knew. Unlawful killing 48 times. It wasn't arson. None of the young people who went to the Valentine's dance were responsible. Now the big lie that has cast a shadow over your lives since the 13th of February 1981 has been lifted once and for all. The Stardust fire robbed your families of a lifetime of happiness. It broke the heart of this city and took the breath of the nation. For 43 years, successive governments obstructed the revealing of truth. Justice was kept out of reach for those left to bear unimaginable loss. Birthdays, Christmases, christenings, weddings, more than 4 decades of family occasions with the trauma of that fire in Artane running through them. So this moment, this victory, this vindication is first and foremost for those unlawfully killed, for the survivors, for the courageous families who have lived for years with the pain of the lies, with the ghosts of unanswered questions, and with the sorrow of the empty chair. The Buddhists say 3 things cannot be long hidden: the sun, the moon, and the truth. For the 48 young people who never came home, finally the truth is revealed. For the survivors who have endured a lifetime of suffering, finally the truth has prevailed. And you, their families, brought the truth home for them. And now let justice flow like a river.
Last Count Carla, I have very vivid memories of the Stardust fire. I was living in Darndale at the time, and my dad was working nights. So he'd come home from work and he'd go to bed. So we as kids would get up early and watch the television so my dad could have his sleep. I remember going down, I can't remember exactly what was on the TV that day, but I remember flicking through the stations and the news of the Stardust came up on the screen. I remember running upstairs to wake me dad to tell him about the fire. I remember the panic in his eyes as it dawned on him that that place would have been packed and that maybe some of his nieces or nephews would have been there. Last Count Carla, we had no house phone at the time, and the nearest phone was up the road from us. And when we got there, there was a queue of people, all distressed, who were all there for the same reason. They were trying to locate their loved ones and to make sure that they were okay. In the days that followed, we saw funeral after funeral, and a dark cloud hung over our community, a dark cloud that hung for far, far too long. The memories of that night will stick with our community forever. Generations of people will live with both the mental and the physical scars that have been caused not only by that fire, but by the treatment of people in our community by the state in the weeks, the months and the years that followed. We were told that the cause of the fire was probable arson, while none of the victims' families believed that to be the case. I can't overstate how insulting that initial finding was, not only to the victims and the survivors, but to our community as a whole. The trauma is still felt to this day. The trauma of the tragedy and the trauma from the way in which the families of the victims and the survivors were treated. From day one, in the eyes of this state, they didn't matter. Instead, it was abuse after abuse, insult after insult, dismissal after dismissal. But here is the truth. They did matter, and they do matter. As a TD for Dublin Bay North, I'm proud to look at the public gallery today and to be here with you while the state gives its long overdue apology. Those beautiful young people who had their whole lives ahead of them mattered. They had hopes, they had dreams, likes and dislikes, hobbies and interests, and all that was taken from them. They were dehumanised, and as their families said, they were bagged and tagged. Their beautiful loved ones reduced to numbers. The pen portraits at the Fresh inquest tried to undo some of that damage, and I commend Dr. Cullinan for facilitating the use of pen portraits. It enabled the families to rehumanise their loved ones, to share with the world everything they loved about them, and the world got to know the victims. Victims like Michael Barrett, who, in the words of his mother, had a great sense of humour and was always willing to lend a hand. Richard Bennett, a wise head on young shoulders who looked after his family and put bread on the table. Carol Bissett, who was academically gifted and had a real ear for music. Jimmy Buckley, an avid GAA fan who did a cracking impersonation of Elvis Presley and was caring and a loving brother. Paula Byrne, a people's person who cared greatly for her family and her friends. Caroline Carey, a talented singer and dancer. John Colgan, who his sister described as a charmer, always seeking to put a smile on people's faces. Jacqueline Croker, a Roaches Stores employee, a hard worker with family at heart, and who was loving and kind. Liam Dunn, a trainee butcher and a friend to many. Michael Farrell, a loving son who would have moved heaven and earth for his mother at the drop of a hat. Michael French, who was training to be an auto electrician and who could turn his hand to anything. David Flood, who talked about owning his own shoe shop. and was handy with a guitar in hand. Thelma Fraser, a beautiful, wide smile and a gentle and kind soul. Josephine Glenn, described as kind and loving, who was happy to babysit for her neighbours because she loved kids. Michael Griffiths, a happy, outgoing man who loved his family, and they all looked up to him. Robert Killock, who grew up in Belfast, he came down to work in Dublin on the building sites after he left school. Brian Hobbs, the youngest of 7, a good worker who loved travelling and he loved making friends. Eugene Hogan, a beautiful singer who was due to move to Kerry with his wife and his 2 young daughters. Murta Kavanagh, who enjoyed cooking, fishing, music and worked as a heating insulator. Martina Keegan, described as a best friend to her sisters and someone they could always confide in. Mary Keegan, who idolised her siblings and who was described as beautiful inside and out. Robert Kelly, a lover of music who enjoyed his job working on the boats and was idolised by all who knew him. Mary Kenny, a loving big sister who was kind, who was funny, who was a great friend and who had a passion for dancing and fashion. Marie Kennedy, described by her younger sister as warm, caring, lively and protective. Mary Kiernan, lover of sports and socialising and a deeply caring person with many, many friends. Sandra Lawless, a generous sister who loved outdoor activities and outdoor life. Frances and Maureen Lawler, husband and wife, parents to Lisa, who was orphaned at 17 months. Paula Lewis, a fan of ABBA and the Bay City Rollers and the Osmonds, and was a loving big sister. Eamon Lockman, a protective big brother whose parents passed away, never seeing the truth or justice for Eamon. Donna Mahon, who worked in the local newsagents, but fitted nicely with her because she loved people. Helena Mangan, a mother who was kind, caring, loving, brave and strong. William McDermott, a protective big brother described as a gentle giant. George McDermott, a joker of the family, a gentle person with a cheeky grin that said he could be up to anything. Marcella McDermott, who spoiled her nephews and was a keen singer and dancer. Julie MacDonald, who did everything to please her mother and siblings, a hard worker that was fun-loving. Teresa MacDonald, who had a perspective for her living life and enjoying every moment of her short life. Gerard McGrath, who had a unique passion for wildlife and had extensive knowledge of garden birds. Caroline McHugh, a keen academic who had passion for the arts. James Miller, engaged to Marion, who travelled the world in the Merchant Navy by the age of 21 before settling back in Dublin. Susan Morgan, a lover of football, who'd moved from Derry to work in Nazareth House care home on the Malahide Road. Darren Morton, a big brother who was football mad and loved socialising with his friends. Kathleen Muldoon, a mature young woman who cared much for her parents, her brothers and her sisters. George O'Connor, quiet and reserved, adored by his younger siblings. Brendan O'Mara, he loved darts and football and was a brilliant Irish dancer. John Stout, a sensitive, gentle person who loved horses, snooker and Elvis. Mary Taunton loved music and concerts, going out with her family and her friends, and she'd plans to travel to Australia. Paul Wade, a twin, a loving brother, described as outgoing and the social focus of his family. Last Ceann Comhairle, I'd like to finish by using a quote from Louise Leach of the McDermott family. On the day of the verdict, she said, "We are taking you out of the flames, the darkness, the smoke of the Stardust, and we are bringing you back to the sunshine and the light and the music, and you are coming back to us."
There are two speakers left in this group.
Like others, I wish to commend the families of the Stardust Fire for their long and courageous battle for justice in the face of opposition, denial and then negotiations, not just the cold shoulder. And that includes Marie Hogan, now Griffin, who did in fact move to Kerry and who gave crucial evidence at the inquest. The families achieved a stunning victory in establishing the inquest initially and then obtaining a finding of unlawful killing based on the facts presented. Families have been dignified, organised and articulate, and many would have given up after the delays, the challenges and the countless years that elapsed as parents and relatives passed away. The work of Dara Mackin and Phoenix Law deserves special recognition. We are fortunate enough to have courageous lawyers who can fight the corner of those who have been ignored by the state, failed by the state or challenged by the state. The Stardust will echo throughout Irish history and should be taught in Irish history. These are ordinary young people out for a night to enjoy themselves, and that it is every parent's nightmare does not do justice to the horror that was inflicted on that night. We can take solace in the courage and strength of ordinary people who fought back against injustice, and the families deserve the tributes, including those at recent football matches, proving that the family campaign enjoys the support of people who understand that this could have happened to them. While today is a day for the families and for the survivors of the Stardust Fire, there are other cases where we have seen state failings for those who are seeking justice for the deceased, with inquests, with inquiries and apologies. For some time, fresh inquests have been requested by the families of the Whiddy Island disaster, whose victims died in atrocious circumstances in 1979. Family members feel that despite repeated requests, they have been ignored time and time again. There, the recorded causes of death for the victims did not reference the circumstances surrounding the fatal incident, including regulatory failures. During their tribunal, it was found that the tanker was in poor condition with evidence of corrosion and leaking, and that Gulf Oil and the employees suppressed the truth about the events that occurred on the night. And to this day, 2 bodies that were recovered remain unidentified, and the state, according to the families, has never employed modern techniques to identify them and give solace to the families. I want to reference, as regards inquiries, the case of Shane O'Farrell, where even this House resolved that there should be an independent inquiry into the circumstances of his death. There, the failure to move on this continues, and the O'Farrell family, I know, draw inspiration and shared solidarity with the Stardust families and their need to do justice. Reference was made by Deputy Hoy to the Kerry Babies case, and in relation to the apologies there, which was given after 40 years. However, the apology was worded to make it unclear exactly what the state was apologising for, and there are still questions to be answered. And it has never been explained how 5 different statements were made in five of the same statements, which dovetailed, were made in 5 different rooms about an event that science said could not possibly be true. Finally, the family of Captain James Kelly is waiting for an apology for more than 50 years. Their attempts to secure an apology from governments have been met with obfuscation and an unwillingness to engage, similar to what happened to the families of the Stardust Fire. The time is now for a full apology for Captain Kelly and for formal recognition that he was acting under orders. We need to see a sea change for those who are treated poorly by the state. People should not have to be in court or marching for justice where a wrong has been committed. That's self-evident, and it's high time that it's recognised.
Good Margaret, Lascan Carla. In 1981, I was head of Sinn Féin Youth. I think I've said this before in the House back in 2017. And I remember clearly the events of that time, issuing a statement, going into a phone box, putting the change in the phone box, ringing up the Irish press. All, phone box don't exist anymore. The Irish press doesn't exist. But I remember clearly, I don't remember where I was when I heard the news of what had happened. Last week, I was privileged to go into the court, and I seen the pictures of the victims up on the wall. I suppose, like everyone else in the court, you were there, sort of. There had been so many false dawns in the past, and you didn't really know what was going to be the outcome. When they read out the names, they were like hammer blows, listening to the one after the other, and how they died, and then then the judge read out the verdict, and it was like a relief for everyone in the room. And I'll never forget, I talked to journalists, they were crying, I was crying, the families were crying, the jury was crying, probably the judge was even crying. And it was cries of relief, but also sadness of all those wasted years that families had to go through. I could talk about, there's not time to talk about the incidents, but I remember young people being arrested that night at Taoiseach. They were trying to break down the doors. With some of them had fire axes that they were had to get off firemen. I think there was another young person that rammed a car into the wall, the toilet wall, to try and get people out. The doors were locked, they were chained, and they couldn't get out. And I remember listening on the radio, Sean Reinhardt, who I knew years ago, used to be the secretary to the group, and Sean was talking about that night, and he survived severe burns. But he talked about the gasp when the lights went out, and the screams then followed. And I suppose for anyone of that generation, those screams will probably live with us, and clearly will live with their families. I remember when I was speaking in here in 2017, and one of my constituents was saying that the thing they always talked about in their home was that no one was ever prosecuted. Nothing ever happened. The owners of the nightclub were rewarded. If that's the word, they were I don't know what the word is. Confiscated. Anyway, I've spoken too long, but I'm really happy for the families here today. I hope they find some solace in what they've heard from the Taoiseach. But I do think that others have mentioned other victims and other people who have we've apologised to belatedly. And I think we need to collectively look at how we treat victims and their families. It changed a generation, and we'll never be the same. I'll never be able to go into a nightclub or a pub cellar without looking to see if there's chains on the doors. I've been abroad, and that's the first thing you look at. If you're in somewhere strange, you'll always look to see that. I wasn't into Stardust, but I'm from that generation, and it's changed us, and it's changed us, hopefully, for the better. But we need to look at those regulations, why they weren't implemented. I heard in the court of the fireball that went up, fire regulations that weren't followed through. And again, as I say, some people that owned that nightclub was rewarded. And I suppose that's the big question that hangs over today. why it was now prosecuted. Thank you.
On behalf of the Labour Party, on this momentous and poignant day for survivors and surviving families of the Stardust victims, I want to welcome all those in the visitors' gallery today. I want to express my deepest sympathies and condolences to you all, to your families, your friends, your communities, on the appalling loss you suffered 43 years ago. And I want to welcome the fact that at last we have seen a full and unreserved state apology offered by the Taoiseach this afternoon. That apology comes following last Thursday's historic verdict, a verdict in the state's longest-running inquest, a historic verdict of unlawful killing, which has been so significant for all affected. And the length of the inquest hearing, of course, pales in comparison to the long quest for truth and justice for the 48 who never came home. Evidence we heard during the inquest offers a tragic insight into the young lives lost that night, and the pen portraits were so powerful in bringing alive all of those children, because some were children, and young people. So many desperately moving stories which were told during the inquest, stories of devastated parents waiting to hear the news of children who were not coming home, husbands, wives, fiancés only able to identify their loved ones by their wedding rings. The jury heard heartbreaking personal stories. The story about Martina Keegan, who had brought a Valentine's Day card to the Stardust for her boyfriend David Morton. That card found the next morning outside the club in water. Others like Richard Bennett, who almost did not go into the Stardust on that awful night. He'd been turned away for not wearing a tie, but he managed to procure one from someone else. And so he was in the Stardust on Valentine's night in 1981, and he too lost his life. All those young people and children whose lives were so tragically lost, cut short when going out for a night with friends and family, something we all do, and 48 of them never made it home. It's been commented before by others like Charlie Bird that were the majority of victims that night from another area of Dublin, those awful deaths, the awful tragedy might have been treated differently by the government of the day. And indeed, the families, all of you, have suffered so much, not just the grief and trauma of the night itself, but the aftermath, the failure of the state to support and stand by families and communities. Injustices like the payment of compensation to the Butterley family that others have mentioned. And the failure of the state and the sense of injustice has compounded the awful grief and trauma suffered by all the families. Nobody should be denied justice or have to endure the hardship and the state failures that we've seen unfolding in the years following the disaster. And we know the number of victims far exceeds those 48 who so tragically died. So many others were injured, so many families bereaved and devastated, so many first responders traumatised, so many physical and mental scars and impacts felt by so many. Surviving families have spoken so movingly of the devastating effect the tragedy has had on their lives, and so many have had to grapple for so long with the decades-long campaign for justice and for answers. And I want to pay particular tribute to one campaigner for justice, one of the campaigners for justice, a wonderful woman whom I've been privileged to know for many years, who lives in my own constituency in Dublin Bay South, Betty Bissett, whose family are from Ringsend in Irishtown, and whose 18-year-old daughter, Carol Bissett, was one of those who died so tragically in the Stardust. Speaking to Kitty Holland, Betty has told of how that night, the night of the Stardust tragedy, marked the day when she and her family found themselves in someone else's nightmare. She's spoken of how she wasn't allowed to go to see Carol, who was in hospital for 3 days before she died. And Betty has spoken of her devastation because she wasn't there to hold her hand and tell her how I love her, she said. She said, I got Carol's coat back and a handful of her jewellery in a plastic bag. And that awful, awful indignity compounded the awful trauma suffered by the Bissett family and so many others. And I was in Betty's house. I was privileged to be there on Saturday with others, and to hear directly from her about her enormous relief that a formal apology would at last be given in the Dáil this week. And that was after they had met with the Taoiseach along with the others. I want to pay tribute to Betty, to her daughter Liz there beside her, and to all the other campaigners in the Stardust Victims and Relatives Committee, to incredible campaigners like Antoinette Keegan, like Gertrude Barrett and Bridget McDermott, for their courage in their grief. And I want to commend you all for your fortitude, the resilience you've shown over the last 4 decades. As we know, many champions of the campaign, like Christine and John Keegan, the late Christine and John, have sadly passed away. But I know so many of you, including Betty and Liz, have joined us in the gallery to watch today's proceedings, and we all hope you will have some comfort and some solace from today. But whatever consolation can be offered by this apology, and indeed by the important inquest verdict, this is more than 4 decades too late. And sadly, we know that over the years there was ample opportunity to address the awful suffering of survivors, and that active steps indeed were taken to evade accountability. The horrific deaths and injuries suffered at the Stardust were compounded by the disrespect and callous treatment of the families, and indeed by the flawed and deeply wrong conclusions of the Keane report. That cruel conclusion of arson, which cast such a dark shadow for far too long over the memories of 48 blameless young people and all the others there that night. And of course, we know that the later 2009 Coffey report, which at last rejected that arson finding, it was edited to remove a line accepting that a new inquiry is necessary if it is the only way of placing on the public record a finding that is based on evidence. But for a freedom of information request, it is likely that that important line in the report would never have come to light. And the effect of the deletion was that a full, robust and honest apology did not then issue in 2009 when it should have. And as others have said, we saw again a step back in 2017. As the saying goes, justice delayed is justice denied. And for all of you in the Stardust families, among the Stardust families and communities, justice has come very slowly. The true facts and the process leading to the holding of the inquest, that historic decision by then Attorney General Seamus Wolfe to hold a new inquest, these facts, as we know, were uncovered by your tireless campaigning, by survivors and surviving relatives, supported by individuals such as Charlie Bird, such as the campaigners like my former Labour colleague Tommy Bruin, who spoke so movingly in the Dáil in 2009 in the wake of the Coffey report, when he pointed out that in Artane, on some streets, every second house had a family connection to one of the tragic victims or survivors of the events. He said the scars relating to what happened that night are still deeply etched across our community and have been made worse by the appallingly shabby and at times almost inhuman way the Stardust victims and relatives have been treated. The road to justice should not have been so hard. And at this opportunity, as the leader of an opposition party which has served in government, I wish to join the Taoiseach and every member of this House, I believe, in offering, on behalf of my own party, a heartfelt apology to the Stardust families. We hear you, we believe you, and we are profoundly sorry, not only for the tragic deaths of your dear loved ones, but also for your subsequent battle for truth, which lasted for 4 decades and which should never have been so difficult. Of course, we know that no apology, no matter how robust, no matter how fulsome, can turn back time, and it cannot bring back those 48 children and young people whose futures were stolen in 1981. But what can change now is the state's attitude to those who suffer a wrong and to society as a whole. Today is a day for apology, for recognition and acknowledgement. But over future days, we must see fresh engagement on other issues of redress, of investigation, and of ensuring that no family will ever have to endure what you have gone through. Because we know that it is the role of the state to place the well-being of the people above all else, and that we must do better to ensure that no family has to go through this again. I want to conclude by acknowledging the immense work of Dr. Myra Cullinan, the coroner, who handled the inquest with such sensitivity. I want to again commend and pay tribute to all of you in the Stardust families and survivors. This day belongs to you. You fought so hard for the memory of your 48 loved ones, and I do hope today's apology will give you some closure. It was good to hear the names of the 48 spoken again in this House. They will be forever remembered here, and indeed all of us of a certain age remember where we were when the news broke. I was 12, nearly a teenager, and all of us in Dublin and across the country who heard the news, all of us, I think, continue to check fire escapes wherever we go. I'm now a mother of teenagers myself, and I can only imagine the horrific heartbreak you are still enduring so many years on. We are truly sorry. You have suffered such appalling loss. Thank you.
The truth shall set you free, or so they say. What we heard last Thursday was indeed the truth. And we can only pray that the truth has indeed begun to set the families of the 48 free. Free from the campaigning, the meetings, the closed doors, the trauma, the criticism, the lies. Free from 43 years of seeking the truth. Free from the disgusting suspicion that the phrase probable arson has hung around the entirety of North Dublin for 2 generations. Free in the knowledge that the souls of the 48 or 49, including Caroline Carey's unborn baby, can indeed now rest in peace and rest in freedom. Growing up in North Dublin, the Stardust was an open wound that never healed. Spoken about in hushed tones, the very word Stardust reminded us of unspeakable horrors. Young people lured into a death trap, their lives and futures stolen from them, their families bereft with grief, all for the hands that fumbled in a greasy till. My granny lived in Donecarney, my father spent his teaching life in Whitehall, my brothers went to school in Chanel. When they spoke of Stardust, it wasn't just the loss of life, it was the stench of injustice. The finding of unlawful killing should have been made 43 years ago. The reasons that it took 43 years are inescapable. It was because of where the fire took place and the background of many of those who attended. A prominently working class community where lives just weren't as important. It is an insult to the very concept of a republic that anyone should live a second-class life or die a second-class death, but it is an undeniable truth. And in this chamber, the symbol of that republic on this day of all days, we must speak the truth, because the truth shall set you free. None of us can possibly comprehend the loss of a child in a fire. To know that your child or sibling or parent could have escaped if the exit doors weren't hampered is a heartbreak. To learn that the immediate tribunal findings were of probable arson and that the owner of the nightclub was the one to get compensated would surely push you over the edge. And many were pushed over the edge. In his book, They Never Came Home, which I must have read 10 times, Neil Fedderson and Tony McCullough write of those numbers outside of the 48. Those who succumbed to the darkness in their minds caused by their loss or by their experiences who didn't make to see this day. Our hearts break for them and for their families today. The truth, we hope, has set you free. We must reflect on that darkness within Irish society that thinks the worst of those who need us to hear the truth, but also a society that thinks the best of those who wear a suit and tie and lie. Not just the nightclub owner who oversaw a disaster waiting to happen, but developers who have constructed fire trap apartment blocks with the full blessing of the political system. We have to ask about those second-class lives who are still not worthy of the truth, or those other cases of injustice from those from the wrong sides of the track. I'm thinking today, for example, of the family of Terence Wheelock, a healthy young man who walked into Store Street Garda Station almost 20 years ago, but came out in a coffin. Those things just don't happen to middle-class men. And indeed, the families of the Dublin Monaghan bombings, who still seek the truth. To the families here today, you have given this country the truth. You have given hope to all who yearn for the truth. You were inspired by the Bloody Sunday families in Derry and the Hillsborough families in Liverpool. And I know what you were told. There was nothing to be achieved in pursuing this campaign, that all evidence was lost, that you need to move on, that you're difficult, that you can't accept the truth. Well, you didn't accept those words because they weren't the truth. You have the truth now. The truth is setting all of us free. There are many who need to be mentioned. Those family members who never grew up, the firefighters on the scene that night, the journalists, especially Charlie Bird, who even when his voice was gone through illness, the truth in his eyes endured. The truth in the words sung by Christy Moore, the classmates with empty desks in their classrooms, the Gardaí, teachers, nurses, doctors, all those public servants for whom Stardust is not a topic of discussion, but a moment when their hearts broke forever. Those in this proud Northside community whose hearts were broken and are still broken. If those you loved were unlawfully killed, then someone unlawfully killed them. It is time for the Gardaí, the DPP and the Minister for Justice to do what is right. What would happen in any other case of corporate manslaughter in any other part of the city? There must be another day in court. Stardust will always be a scar, a tale of greed, a tale of recklessness, a tale of horror, of poisonous lies, but of resilience, of hope, of campaigning, and of truth. The Stardust families are heroes of this republic. We are honoured to be in their presence today. They would much rather not be here. They would much rather have seen their loved ones grow older in the last 43 years. But you have all made us want to be better, to work harder, to campaign more, to listen more, to judge less, and to speak the truth. The truth, we hope, has set you free and set free the souls of Michael, Richard, Carol, James, Paula, Caroline, John, Jacqueline, Liam, Michael, David, Thelma, Michael, Josephine, Michael, Robert, Brian, Eugene, Myrta, Martina, Mary, Robert, Mary, Margaret, Sandra, Francis, Maureen, Paula, Eamon, George, Marcella, William, Julie, Teresa, Gerard, Caroline, Donna, Helena, James, Susan, David, Kathleen, George, Brendan, John, Margaret, and Paul. All their faces that rightfully hung up on the wall of the Rotunda Inquest Hall. An injustice on this scale can fester and make you feel that you can never trust the state again. But earlier I saw a rose in the gallery. And from this darkness, maybe something can grow. Truth and hope. Truth will always set us free.
I want to start by warmly welcoming the members of the Stardust family who are here today. It's been a long and difficult road to justice, but your perseverance, courage, and deep love of your family members has brought us here to this historic but long overdue day. Taoiseach, it's less than a week since the jury in the Stardust inquest returned the verdicts that families and survivors have waited so long for. Recognition that on that terrible night on the 14th of February 1981, 48 young people were unlawfully killed. It's a date that will be forever associated with this country's worst ever fire tragedy, a tragedy that is seared into the Irish psyche. Such was the magnitude of the disaster, most people can remember exactly where they were and what they were doing when they first heard about the horrific nightclub fire in Artane. At the outset, I want to acknowledge the fast pace of the government's response this week to the families' calls for a comprehensive and meaningful state apology for the litany of wrongs perpetrated against the victims of the course of 4 decades. It's also welcome that the Stardust families and their legal team were afforded the opportunity to have an input into what should be included in today's apology. The speed of the response is not only appropriate and proper, it is the very minimum that they deserve. It makes a refreshing change to see the state doing the right thing when it comes to its treatment of Stardust families. Because never has the expression justice delayed is justice denied been more applicable to any group of people than the Stardust relatives and survivors. Never have the victims of such a grave injustice had to fight for so long to vindicate the rights of their loved ones. So long, in fact, that many parents and relatives, despite campaigning for justice for more than half of their lives, did not live to witness this or last week's monumental verdicts of unlawful killing. They too, along with those who perished in the fire or were injured that night, are very much in our thoughts today. Last week's verdicts represented a rare victory in the Stardust family's decades-long campaign for justice. Theirs has been a journey of false dawns, countless setbacks, and bitter disappointments. Senior Dublin City Coroner Myra Cullinan is owed a debt of gratitude for the impartial, respectful and sensitive manner in which these inquests were conducted. Equally, members of the jury have done this country an enormous public service, giving a year of their lives to sit through hours of complex evidence and often harrowing testimony. There is no doubt that they arrived at the correct verdict last week when they determined that all 48 victims had been unlawfully killed. However, in the past few days, the relief and the joy that greeted these verdicts has given way to justifiable public anger. Anger that it has taken so long to get to this point. Anger that many parents did not live to see this watershed moment. Anger that the suffering of the families and survivors was compounded by state inaction. Deeply ingrained classism and an adversarial legal system that often seemed weighted in favour of the wealthy. In 2019, when directing that there should be a new inquest, the then Attorney General Seamus Wolfe said there had been an insufficiency of inquiry at the original inquest in March 1982 as to how the deaths occurred. Insufficiency of inquiry is an understatement, to say the least. The latest inquest sat for 122 days, lasted almost a year and heard from over 370 witnesses. This is in stark contrast to the 1982 inquest, which concluded after just 5 days, with its findings confined to the medical causes of death, not the surrounding circumstances, such as the cause of the fire. It makes you wonder how different things could have been for the families had the original inquest arrived at the same conclusion which was reached last week. Would such a verdict have influenced the final report of the Keane Tribunal, which just months later delivered the devastating conclusion that the fire was probably started deliberately? Would it have prevented the owners of the Stardust from proceeding with their malicious damages case against Dublin Corporation, which led to them receiving compensation of £580,000 in 1983? Would an unlawful killing verdict in 1982 have resulted in a speedier path to compensation for victims, families, and those left with life-changing injuries? Today is about an official state apology, not redress. That may be a matter for another day, and it's one that should be informed by the Stardust family's wishes. But it's worth pointing out that more value was put on the loss of a building than the loss of life. Appallingly, the government compensation scheme paid bereaved parents just £7,500 for each child that died in the Stardust fire. Detailed evidence on key issues that led to so many deaths and injuries, such as the status of fire exits, breaches of building regulations and insufficient staff training, was all available back then. As this evidence was fresh at the time, it is baffling that the jury in the most recent inquest, at a remove of 4 decades, was able to properly interrogate the facts and establish now what could not have been determined then. The fact that this did not happen at the time is a tragedy in and of itself. Parents would not just have known how their children died, they would have known why. Instead, despite being paralysed with unimaginable grief, they were forced into a David versus Goliath battle with the state and its institutions. Abandoned by successive governments, they were forced to take their search for justice to the streets. No campaign group in Ireland's history have had to protest as much or for as long as they have. They've had to fight the state at every single turn, even for the most basic entitlements. They fought for the return of medical cards, initially issued to those injured in the fire, but later cruelly withdrawn. They fought for a memorial park in Coolock to ensure that those who never came home would never be forgotten. They fought for a new inquiry into the cause of the fire, only to see their hopes evaporate after several government-sanctioned reviews. Before last Thursday's verdicts, the only real significant victory secured by Stardust campaigners was a finding in Paul Coffey's 2009 report that there was no evidence for the probable arson conclusion reached by the Keene Tribunal in 1982. The suggestion of arson heaped pain upon pain and cast unfounded suspicion on every person who attended the Stardust disco that fateful night. Understandably, this was seen by families as a case of victim blaming at its most hurtful. The Dáil record was corrected to remove this damaging conclusion following publication of the Coffey report in 2009. Up until then, the families and survivors were forced to live with this smear on their good names for 27 years. But neither this report nor a subsequent review of evidence by retired Judge Pat McCartan recommended a new inquiry. However, undeterred by yet another disappointment, incredibly, the families picked themselves up and successfully made the case for a new inquest into the death of their loved ones. The striking of the probable arson theory from the public record in 2009, while welcome, did not resolve the issue of how the fire started. Last week's inquests also confirmed what many had long suspected, that the fire was caused by an electrical fault. Today's apology must mean more than words. It must mark a turning point for reform in how victims of injustice are treated in this country. The government must examine and change a culture in which victims of state wrongdoing are viewed with suspicion and met with official pushback and legal impediments when they challenge the authorities. Biases in the system must also be seriously addressed to provide equality before the law. The Stardust families must now be afforded the time and space to reflect on the events of the past week and decide where they want to go from here. While their sense of loss and pain will be lifelong, I sincerely hope that last week's verdicts and today's state apology will bring some comfort and some help with the healing process. You should know today that this House and the entire country is behind you and that your loved ones will never be forgotten.
Thank you, Deputy Keelan Fallon.
Thank you, Cathaoirleach. 43 years. 43 years. I want to join Cathaoirleach with others in welcoming the families to the gallery here today and in saying that the unlawful killing verdict is indeed very welcome. The formal state apology that's been given is very welcome. The inquest's conclusion as to how the fire started and why it spread so rapidly is welcome. It has put to bed once and for all the original tribunal's conclusion that the fire was probably started deliberately, a highly damaging finding that pointed the finger of blame at the very community that had suffered the most. This conclusion may have been removed from the public record in 2009, but it left questions as to the cause of the fire unanswered officially until last week. An inquest is a statement of fact, and the families and relatives now have official confirmation of what they have always known to be true. that this was not in any way their fault, that their loved ones were unlawfully killed. Cathaoirleach, for most of us, the anguish and trauma of losing your loved ones in a fire is utterly unimaginable. To have your son or daughter go out for the evening, for them to never return home, and for them to die in a horrific fire would break any parent's heart. It's difficult to imagine the level of the panic felt by mothers and fathers who woke that Saturday morning to find their children's beds empty. You can't even begin to think what it must have been going through their minds as they began the frantic search for their loved ones in Garda stations and hospitals, and sadly, for some, to the makeshift morgue at the Dublin Coroner's Court, where a tent had to be erected by the Army Medical Corps due to the mounting death toll. It was here some of the most distressing scenes were witnessed, with many parents handed items of jewellery or pieces of clothing so their children could be identified. 5 victims went to their graves without being identified, their bodies placed side by side in a common plot in St. Fintan's Cemetery in Sutton. It would take until 2007 before advances in DNA technology allowed for these victims to be finally identified. The concentration of victims who came from within a 1 mile radius of the Stardust was staggering. It's hard to find a family in this part of the city that has not been impacted in some way by the tragedy. The tight-knit Northside community still bears the scars of that dreadful night and its immediate aftermath. The multiple funerals, the empty school desks the following week, the colleagues who would never turn up for work again. For many families, the passage of time did not ease the pain. This was not helped by the lack of counselling or mental health supports for families and survivors, just one of many state failings in the official response to the Stardust tragedy. 14 years after the fire, a report given to the World Congress of the Federation of Mental Health found that many parents were still utterly consumed by grief. When the report's findings were presented at a conference in Trinity College, one doctor described the families as quite an ill population. Some of the parents interviewed reported a deterioration in their physical health. Others said there'd been no lessening of their feelings of loss since the fire. We know other parents had died of heartbreak. To think that these same parents would be put through another 3 decades of waiting for a dignified response from the state, heaping trauma upon trauma, is simply beyond our comprehension. It is the unwavering love for their lost ones that drove these families to persist for 43 years in seeking the truth. Cathaoirleach, I want to pay tribute to the 48 people who lost their lives as a result of unlawful killing in Stardust and who never came home. I want to pay tribute to those who survived the fire and lived the rest of their lives with the trauma of that night, where they lost brothers and sisters and friends who did not make it out alive. I want to pay tribute to those emergency service workers, hospital staff, doctors, taxi drivers, and all those who cared for and supported the victims of the fire and survivors in that awful night. To pay tribute to the families who lost their loved ones in Stardust and who campaigned year in and year out for the truth for their loved ones. And I want to especially pay tribute to those family members, many of them parents, who did not live to see this day and never got to hear their loved ones' reputations being exonerated last week. The families who lost loved ones have had to fight every step of the way for over 43 years. Who of us can imagine what that would be like? The pain of losing your son or daughter, or brother or sister, or your parents, and then have to fight every step of the way for truth and justice, only to have the state and the political establishment turn their backs on you and frustrate you at every turn. They were ignored. They weren't believed. They felt treated like second-class citizens. And let's not pretend that this shameful mistreatment all belongs to the distant past. It does not. Even when the decision was taken to hold the inquests, the families and their legal representatives had to fight step by step to make sure that the process would work. They had to fight for a workable system of legal aid. They had to ask again and again for the inquest to be set up in a way that could work. They even had to fight for a venue to hold the inquests. time after time, they had to keep pushing, simply so that the truth could be established. Today, the Stardust families finally have truth on their side after 43 years. Have lessons been learned, Cathaoirleach? When it comes to building standards and regulations, we still have a very long way to go. 2 words sum up the problem: light touch regulation. Light touch. What we still have in Ireland is a form of light touch building control and regulation. How many times in recent years have we seen fires rip through homes where there was meant to be proper fire separation and compartmentalisation? Why is it still not being taken as seriously as it needs to be? Cathaoirleach, the fire safety regulations have just been reviewed and updated. One of the issues that I raised in the submission was that of smoke toxicity. As smoke, not fire, generally kills people, the level of smoke toxicity in building materials is hugely important. On the 14th of June 2017, 72 people lost their lives at Grenfell Tower in a devastating fire. While many factors contributed to this horrendous loss of life, exceptionally high levels of smoke toxicity was a key issue. A 2004 report from the UK's Building Research Establishment noted that just 2 countries in Europe have no standards with respect to smoke toxicity levels. Those 2 countries were the UK and Ireland. It is alarming that building regulations with respect to fire safety, and which have been updated, fail to regulate and limit smoke toxicity levels. When will the lives of people be put first, ahead of the interests of the companies that continue to lobby for low standards? Cathaoirleach, a state apology after 43 years is without a doubt the correct thing to do, but we can and we should do better than that. As legislators, we can get things right in the first place. We can stand up against light touch regulation and regulations written by industry and for industry. We can put the lives of people first. No one should ever have to go through what the 48 families have had to endure over the last 4 decades. If we are serious about that, then we need to be serious about fire safety standards and regulation. And in addition to today's overdue apology, this would be a fitting and enduring tribute to the 48 young people who so needlessly lost their lives in the Stardust fire.
People for Profit Solidarity Deputy Richard Pybard. 10 minutes.
There's been much has been said today, and first of all, I just hope that for the families of those who lost their loved ones and for the survivors that the state apology and the words spoken here today can do something to provide the solace, the truth and the justice that you have very, very long deserved and that you have fought for. I'm very conscious, really, that I'm not qualified to know or understand the pain, the loss, the injustice, the trauma, the hardship that you have endured as a result of the loss of your loved ones and the obstacles that have been put in your way for 43 years in trying to get the truth and justice that you deserve. And I can only say what I know that some of you feel, and I suspect all of you feel, that it is deplorable and shameful that it has taken 43 years to get to this moment. And it is only because of your courage, your bravery, your determination, and your ceaseless campaigning that finally a political system that has failed you, that successive governments who have failed you, have been forced finally, to give you some degree of the vindication and the acknowledgement that you have so long deserved. And also because of the public support that you have got from so many people when the political system and when successive governments failed you. So many ordinary people stood with you and supported your ceaseless campaign for justice. And I know from talking to some of the families that there is great sadness today that some of those who fought over all of these years are not here to see this moment of acknowledgement and of truth and the apology that we have seen from the government. I don't know all of them, but certainly I've met some of them over the years that I have encountered the families and their campaign. People like Eugene Barrett and Christine, obviously, I received from Mark Fraser, the brother of Thelma Fraser, an email today just referring to their father Arthur. And I thought I should read. I know that at the inquest, the pen portraits were a very, very important opportunity for the families to remind people of the terrible human, individual, family loss that you all suffered, of the futures snatched away, of the impact over generations that this tragedy, this loss, and this great injustice has had on all of your families. But Mark sent me an email and asked to just reference it. But I know the sentiments in this can probably are expressed and felt for all of the families. But I thought I'd just read of something of what he said. My sister Thelma Fraser, the eldest of 9 children, went to the Stardust with her boyfriend Michael Farrell and were unlawfully killed. They never came home. Thelma was small in stature with a big heart who loved and cared for the younger siblings when Mam took part-time evening work. Thelma volunteered with the Order of Malta as a cadet leader. It was 3 agonising days before Thelma was identified through dental records and jewellery. This was devastating for our close family, especially our parents. They were left heartbroken. Our neighbours and friends in Bath Avenue, Sandymount were really great, kind and supportive. Both my parents died in their mid-50s within 10 years of the fire from the stress and strain of dealing with the aftermath of the fire. My father Arthur made it his sole focus in life to get to the truth of the fire and what happened on that night. He was devastated when the Keene Tribunal said it was probable arson, despite the Gardaí saying there was no evidence of arson. This tarnished all the victims of the fire. We have waited 43 years, despite every agency of the state placing hurdles in front of us to prevent us from obtaining the truth. During the recent inquest, we heard evidence which was difficult to listen to at times from survivors and emergency services. I don't have time to read it all, but I'll just read the last paragraph where he says, "My sister Thelma deserved a long life with Michael. My parents deserved to grow old to see grandchildren. My brothers and sisters deserved comfort and reassurance from our family, but were denied because of the greed of a rich and powerful family." And I'm sure that account speaks for not just the Fraser family, but for many, many of the families. And I hope today is the beginning of the truth, because it's certainly, I think, not the end. An apology is not enough. There has to be true justice and true accountability for those that frustrated your fight for truth and for justice for your loved ones. The state has to explain and own up to its own responsibility in all of this. How could there have been reports, now that we know the truth, and the families always knew the truth, how could there have been reports that blamed the victims and put that stigma and that tarnishing of their reputations, that sent a message, we don't believe you, we don't care, and blamed those who were the victims of this terrible injustice? How could it be when, in the small part I played in this, when Antoinette and the campaigners compiled the evidence, new evidence, in 2016, 2017, and I remember walking across this chamber handing the evidence they had provided to the then Minister of Justice, where they were seeking the commission of investigation, and they were ignored, and that was dismissed. And it took further campaigning by the families. I remember standing out on the streets with the cards, the postcards, handing them out, getting the public who signed them in their thousands and thousands to ask for the inquest that was finally granted. How is it that the only person who was ever persecuted following the unlawful killing of 48 young people in the Stardust fire was Christy Moore, the singer, who wrote a song about the truth? How is it that the owner of the Stardust received €500,000 in compensation, whereas the families suffered 43 years of the struggle, the tarnishing of their reputations, of being implied that they were lying, and all the impacts, terrible impacts that they felt, and the loss that they had suffered, that they had to fight for this moment. So I just want to commend you. This is your day. We're only here because of what you have done in your ceaseless fight for justice, because of the love you had for your family members who lost their lives, but were killed, as we now know. Killed because, as Mark Fraser said, because of the greed of a rich and powerful family and the failure of the state to provide its resources to get to the truth, but to ignore and dismiss your struggle for justice for 43 years. But this is your day, and I hope this is the beginning. And all I will say to the government is, this must be led by the families. What follows from here must be led by the families. Only they know what truth and justice means, and to provide that for their loved ones and those who survived this terrible tragedy and injustice.
Deputy Paul Morgan.
Thanks, Chair. The first thing I want to do is just to pay tribute to all of the relatives, the survivors. Your struggle, your determination, your resilience is incredibly inspiring. Against the backdrop of experiencing such horrific tragedy, trauma, and then faced with a state determined to cover up what happened, determined to block the struggle for the truth, and in the face of you and your loved ones being slandered, being lied about, just keeping going. Obstacle after obstacle, no justice here, no justice there, one door after another closed to you, and just keeping going. It is really, really remarkable. It is inspiring. And exactly as Richard said, it's only because of you, it's only because of your struggle that we are here today, that we have an acknowledgement of the truth that you've been fighting to have exposed. And it's obviously completely right and proper and appropriate that we have this state apology today. But it is worth asking the question how this happened, how you were forced to fight for the truth for 43 years. And it wasn't an accident. The state didn't just fail you by not listening enough, by not moving quickly enough, by the normal wheels of justice not operating because something happened. It is worse than that. The state engaged in a cover-up to deny the truth, to protect the powerful, to protect those responsible, and to blame the victims. That's what happened. And at the root of it, exactly as been said, is greed. You know, the essence of this horrific tragedy is the greed of people who wanted to make as much money as they possibly could without regard to the fire regulations and without regard to people's lives. Therefore, they block or lock the exits to stop people getting in without paying. They don't pay for fire safety training for the staff, and they use the infamous carpet tiles on the walls because they're cheaper, regardless of the fact that the fire is going to spread quicker as a result. It's about money. But then people who do that are rich and politically connected, whereas those who are victims are overwhelmingly working class young people. And then the machinery of the state moves into action, not to do what it's meant to do, which is to deliver justice to people, but to protect injustice and to spread a lie about you and your relatives. That's what the Keane report is about. There's no other way that it makes sense that he can write that the evidence of a motive for a deliberate act of arson on the premises remains tenuous, and go on in that terms, and yet also find that the more probable cause was arson. This was part of a cover-up, part of a slander, part of a lie against yourselves. The obscenity that resulted from that, in that those who profited originally from the tragedy, again profiting from that ridiculous finding which had no basis in fact, being able to profit again to the tune of £580,000. Absolutely obscene. And that, as has been mentioned, those who tried to tell the truth were silenced. Incredible. And if you look at the words in the song that Christy Moore was singing, he's just saying, we don't know how the fire started. And they said that was contempt of court, because they wanted to tell the lie that it was started by working class young people, could be any one of the victims, could be any one of the survivors. And incredibly found in contempt of court for simply saying that. Just to finish, we have to acknowledge, we now have acknowledgement that there was unlawful killing. But those who did the unlawful killing must be brought to justice. That's the next step.
Deputy McBarry.
After 43 years, at last, some measure of justice. What a massive vindication for the families who refused to take no for an answer and who refused to be ground down by the system. Everybody knows that the verdict is down to your steadfast campaigning on behalf of your loved ones. Everybody knows that the political and the judicial establishments put every obstacle possible in the way of justice down through the decades. Nearly 20 successive governments came, went, and did nothing while this injustice festered. Never forget, the state attempted to smear the name of young people from the surrounding communities. Tribunal Chairman, High Court Justice Keane, appointed by the government of Charles J. Haughey, found the cause of the fire to be probable arson. Keane's verdict allowed the owners, a Fianna Fáil fundraiser, the man whose premises had bars on the bathroom windows and chains on the fire exits, paint himself as a victim before going down to the court, making a claim against the corporation and pocketing £539,000, €2 million in today's money. Unlawful killing of 48 young people. That is what the state has now ruled. So we will watch with interest to see if criminal prosecutions now follow. Some people say that Ireland does not have a class system. That's not true. That never was true. And if anyone out there ever doubts it, just look at the story of the Stardust. This was about social class from beginning to end. Taoiseach, I believe that if your apology is sincere, the state must also stop denying justice for other families, including those who have waited 45 years for justice for those who died at Whitty. I understand that the families have requested a meeting with you and fresh inquests. You should agree to the former and the state should grant the latter. I'll finish my remarks off simply by just saluting the men and women in the gallery here today. This is your day, though of course you should never have had to go through it.
Thank you, Deputy. Regional Group Deputy Fiona Murphy, 10 minutes.
Thank you, Cathaoirleach. I'm privileged to be here to address you today. As a member of this House, I'm only 4 years elected. I would have been 9 years old when the tragedy happened. I can't pretend to remember, but I certainly know I have felt everything that has been said through the inquest in the last number of days. Every name I've heard, every family that's been remembered, and particularly those who are no longer here, but also those whose lives changed forever, not just those that were lost in the Stardust tragedy. Many of you have fought for 43 years, a fight that you didn't want to fight. And there is no denying you were put through that by the state. But the state is just another name for everybody that enters this House. We are elected representatives and we're elected by the people. This is known as Leinster House. It's otherwise known as the People's House. And all too often, we forget who puts us here. And for me, it has nothing to do with class, nor should it. But given what you've been through for 43 years and the evidence that we have heard, it does appear to have had something to do with class. But a life is a life. And whether it's 48 young people who died through no fault of their own, or many others that we've heard of over the decades, the state can do better and must do better, and that includes me. I haven't had interaction with any of you except for Antoinette Keegan, who wrote to me in 2022 and asked me to make a donation to the Stardust Fund. I made a paltry donation and I'm ashamed at how paltry it was. But all I can say is that I have learned more in the last week about how we should serve the people who elect us than I have had over the 4 years I've been here. And I do struggle sometimes with what we are elected to do, because it's sometimes very difficult to make the right decisions. And I sit in the opposition benches, and I have huge admiration today for the people who have told their story and have had the resolve
for 43 years. But I also have admiration for the Taoiseach, in his short time elected, to have reversed the poor decisions that have put you through that for 43 years in making the decision to admit that we were wrong. And it's in that, I'm sure, it's no consolation. But it begins another fight, and that fight is to understand now whether or not what you've heard today is sincere and will turn out to be true to form. Because yes, I look forward to a day when we will look back and celebrate what we have learned through the awful tragedy of the Stardust. And that will come, no doubt, in the form of a commemoration in which probably once a year those in our privileged position will be invited to attend a commemoration ceremony while you live with it every day for the rest of your lives. And I'd ask the Taoiseach, on behalf of those who are left here and those who have no doubt put in 43 years, hard fighting, hard slog, lost loved ones, failed on days to keep up the fight, but got resolve from somewhere, that we do not put them through it when we decide on what the redress should be. Not only should they be part of it, but they should not even be asked to fight for it. Money will not compensate anybody, but it's how we decided previously. And we have been wrong in this House, and we have not been listened to. And I don't wish to take from anything that might happen or any of what you feel today, but we have redress schemes that have left people out. And our most recent did not encompass children under the age of 6 months old who had gone through mothers' and babies' homes. And I only in the last week listened to Christina Buckley's interviews, and we should be ashamed. And we should not repeat that mistake. And so I don't need to go any further. I just want to say I have huge admiration for the people who have come here today, and I will try to do better as an elected representative. Thank you.
Peter Fitzpatrick.
On the night of the 14th of February 1981, many parents' worst nightmare came true. 48 young people in the prime of their life went out to the Stardust nightclub in Artane to celebrate St. Valentine's Day, but never came home. Witness spoke of fire exits being locked and chained, denied by management, 2 inquests, 1 tribunal of inquiry, a compensation tribunal, and a number of investigations and reports, as well as countless hours spent campaigning. The families of those 48 young people who died in the nightclub fire have fought for more than 4 decades to get justice. Within these inquiries, these families have to relive the hauntingly traumatic and detailed injuries and cause of deaths of their loved ones. There was a chain around their neck, not able to move forward. They were left with no closure, no defined ruling on the fire cause, and rightly so felt deeply angered and hurt over the treatment by the state. Thankfully, after 43 years, this week a verdict of unlawful killing was returned by the jury of all 48 people who died in the disaster. I am acutely aware that the number affected by the Stardust is far and wide who have carried with this them for over 45 years. The devastation which tragedy caused to a local community and Ireland as a whole, to the survivors who bravely relived that traumatic experience by speaking the truth in their harrowing testimonies, and the first responders who fought unimaginably carnage, heaps of bodies and body parts. A fleet of ambulances and taxis took the dead and dying to several Dublin hospitals, which were in danger of becoming overwhelmed by casualties. The mass deaths of innocents, exacerbated by the exhausting battle for answers by those left behind. Lax fire laws under which the nightclub was inspected in 1980 were drawn up under the Act in 1890. There was no denying that the persistent failure of successive governments to deal with the outdated legislation in relation to fire sales and billing to which the public had access, notably discos, hotels, pubs and nightclubs, led to this tragedy. The outdated legislation applicable at the time did not place the responsibility on the owners of these places. As a result, fire access doors could be obstructed, windows barred for security reasons. Additionally, far too few personnel in the fire services or the local authorities were fully qualified to carry out thorough inspections of the buildings to ensure that fire safety requirements were carried out. And the safety regulations then enforced had not been amended to take account of new range of plastic products such as polythene and other hazardous potentials. The handoff approach was driven by the ideology that property is a private matter, even though public safety is clearly a public matter. Even now, we only have to look how Micra and Pirate have fallen back on the public purse. These are regular failures, repeated time after time. There was no accountability, only laws. We have a very weak system of control, and we should have good standards and proper enforcement, and this needs to change immediately. The government needs to firstly look at existing regulations in relation to safety and accountability. A working group which examined defects in houses in 2022 found a lack of fire safety material, structural defects, water ingress, and are likely to affect up to 80% of apartments and duplexes built between 1991 and 2013 in much of the Celtic Town area, which equates to between 62,500 and 100,000 homes. The problem being that fire certs are not being approved and granted to developers based on submitted plans. No further inspections or follow-up is carried out to ensure compliance to plans. Defective construction work is a breach of the building contract, yet developers can commonly claim liquidation and set up new companies with no accountability. Current legislation needs to be addressed, such as the Private Resolution Board, should also be meant to advance redress rapidly. However, the government needs to provide a genuine, meaning and uncredible state apology to the families of the victims and survivors of the Stardust tragedy. Maybe seeing justice being done will help a little with the victims rest in peace at last, but it's been a long time coming. Tanaiste, as a parent and a grandparent, I would like to commend my enormous gratitude to the families, the friends and all the people involved for getting us here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. Rural Independent Group, Deputy Michael Healy-Rae. You sharing time?
And first of all, I want to say to the family representatives that are here today, first of all, I'm very glad that you are here, but I'm so sad that you have to be here, because today finds us at the culmination of a lifetime of a battle. It's over a lifetime of a battle in time, really. The Stardust fire disaster has been a long-standing symbol of injustice in our country. The families of the victims have been left down by successive governments, the state and the legal system. I'm glad that you have received a state apology here today. And now is the time to establish a victims and families compensation scheme. While no amount of compensation can ever bring back the loved ones lost in the Stardust fire, it is crucial to acknowledge that a compensation scheme serves a different purpose. It is not a solution to the pain of loss, but rather a proper recognition of the state's neglect and failure to protect its citizens. The establishment of a compensation scheme free from obstacles is a necessary step towards justice. It acknowledges the time the families have lost and the struggle they have endured in their quest for justice. This scheme should not be seen as a mere financial settlement, but as a symbol of the state's commitment to righting the wrongs of the past. Moreover, this compensation scheme should serve as a reminder of the state's responsibility to ensure the safety and well-being of its citizens and to prevent such tragedies from happening in the future. It is a testament to the resilience of the families, their unwavering pursuit of truth and their fight for justice. It is a call for accountability, a demand for justice, and a pledge for a safer future. It is a promise that the lives lost in the Stardust fire will never, ever be forgotten, and that their legacy will continue to inspire change and foster resilience in the face of adversity. For years, the families of the victims carried the very heavy burden of seeking justice for their loved ones. The verdict of unlawful killing finally brought some relief. This verdict, announced by the jury at the inquests of the 48 young people who tragically lost their lives in the 1981 nightclub fire, was indeed met throughout the country, not least of all by the families, with a mix of emotions. The inquests, which were the longest ever held in Ireland, were ordered after the families fought a lengthy legal battle. They were a stark contrast to the original inquests held in 1982, which only lasted a mere 5 days and focused on the medical cause of the deaths rather than the actual circumstances leading to the fire. The fire, which occurred in the nightclub complex in Artane in Dublin, led to the inquiry of the Keane Tribunal in 1982. The tribunal's strange and deeply cynical conclusion that the fire was probably caused deliberately was strongly opposed by the Stardust families. This conclusion allowed the nightclub owners to claim compensation from Dublin Corporation, which added massive insult to injury. The Dáil thankfully overturned the arson findings in 2009, but this was only a very partial victory for the families. They needed the full facts of what happened on that night on Valentine's Day to be brought to light. Now the truth has been revealed. The fire started due to an electrical fault and was first seen between 1:20 a.m. and 1:40 a.m. The jury found that the foam used in the seats, the carpets, the tiles, and at the height of the ceiling contributed to the spread of the blaze. Factors such as a lack of visibility due to black smoke, the toxicity of the gases and smoke heat, the failure of the emergency lighting and the doors that were locked, chained or obstructed, not only prevented escape, but also contributed to the massive death toll. The families who have been persistent in overcoming the obstacles placed before them rightfully deserved the state apology here today. The Stardust fire disaster is probably one of the greatest injustices in our country's history. It's disgraceful how it was quickly swept under the rug all those years ago, especially when those who were left behind were still in a state of severe shock. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to express my deepest sympathy to the families of the Stardust victims. The pain and loss they have endured is unimaginable. I would like to acknowledge the unwavering determination and dedication displayed by the families in their pursuit of truth and justice. Their resilience in the face of adversity is truly commendable. It is important to recognise that the journey to this point has been a long and arduous one for the victims and their families. It is my sincere hope that this acknowledgement brings some measure of solace to those affected by this tragedy. The Stardust fire disaster, one of the greatest injustices in our country's history, is a story of relentless pursuit of truth, profound commitment to justice and a heartbreaking tragedy. The inquest into the disaster were the longest ever held in Ireland, ordered after the families fought a lengthy legal battle. These inquests starkly contrasted the original ones held in 1982, which lasted only 5 days and focused merely on the medical cause of deaths rather than the circumstances leading to the fire. The fire, which occurred at the nightclub complex in Artane, Dublin, led to an inquiry, the Keane Tribunal in 1982. The tribunal's conclusion that the fire was probably caused deliberately was strongly opposed by the Stardust family. This conclusion, deeply cynical and strange, allowed the nightclub owners to claim compensation from Dublin Corporation, adding insult to injury. The Tribunal of Inquiry that convened within 3 weeks of the fire found the probable cause was arson. outraging the families, who said it smeared the dead and allowed the nightclub manager, Eamon Buttery, to claim $580,000 compensation for malicious damage. This infuriated survivors and relatives of the dead, who saw it as a victim blaming. The coroner, Myra Cullinan, acknowledged the families' persistence in obtaining a fresh inquest. She hoped that the families took some solace from the fact that these fresh inquests were held, the facts surrounding the deaths were examined in detail, and that the families felt fully involved in the proceedings. The inquest findings were a result of tireless campaigning by the families, with no thanks to any government. Last Thursday represented a day of vindication. In 2009, the Dáil overturned the arson findings, but this was only a partial victory for the families. They needed the full facts of what happened on that fateful Valentine's Day to be brought to light. Now the truth has been revealed. The fire started due to an electrical fault and was first seen between 1:20 a.m. and 1:40 a.m. The jury found that the foam used in the seats, carpet tiles and the height of the ceilings contributed to the spread of the blaze factors, such as lack of visibility due to black smoke, the toxicity of the gases and the smoke heat, the failure of the emergency lighting indoors that were locked, chained or obstructed, not only prevented escape but also contributed to the death toll. The families who have been persistent in overcoming the obstacles placed before them deserve today's state apology. It's disgraceful how this disaster was quickly swept under the rug, especially when those left behind were still in shock. Last week, the truth about the events of Valentine's Night 1981 came to light. The inquest jury found that 48 young people were unlawfully killed after an electrical fault started at a fire in the Stardust nightclub. The fire killed 48 people, aged 16 to 27, injured 214, and left questions over how it started and why it claimed so many victims. The families said previous efforts, including a tribunal inquiry, a victim compensation tribunal, and 2 legislature-appointed reviews, were rushed or botched, reflecting official indifference to working-class communities. Successive governments over 4 decades had failed the families and the victims of honour, but also a day of deep sadness, hurt and regret. We must think in particular of those whose passing means this conclusion comes too late for them. If the state's apology to the Stardust family and the victims is based on a moral code, as opposed to empty political rhetoric, you, Taoiseach, should be, on behalf of this state, meet with the Whiddy Island families as a matter of urgency, and in that meeting deliver news that fresh inquests have been ordered by your Attorney General as they seek justice for the fireball explosion which claimed the lives of 50 innocent people off of Bantry in 1979. The state must also urgently review the manner in which inquests are being conducted in the state and the verdicts available to jurors. The Stardust tragedy was one of the darkest moments in our history, a heartbreaking tragedy because of the lives that were lost, the families that were changed forever, and the long drawn-out struggle for justice that followed. Their relentless pursuit of truth and accountability, their profound commitment to justice, even in the face of commitment to justice, even in the face of overwhelming challenges and setbacks, was not only a fight for their loved ones, but a campaign to ensure that such a disaster never happens again. It's time for the state to step up and make amends.
Thank you, Deputy
Thank you, Chair. My deepest sympathies to the families that are here today for the loss of their children, their sisters, their brothers, their relations. In 1981, on the 14th of April, a night of love. I was 11 years old. I'm a father of 4 children, all of the ages of the same children that died in the Stardust. I'm now a grandfather. But it's taken 43 years for government to say, I'm sorry. 43 years. For all these families and loved ones that have gone before today, fighting for justice for their loved ones. 43 years. As a parent myself, I cannot comprehend what any one of these people have gone through. And no apology from myself or anyone in this room will make up for the years of loss by people saying, I got it wrong, I'm sorry, and give people a piece of life that they can move on to say they have vindicated for their family. They now know what happened. They now know what happened. That's a failure on a lot of people throughout these years. But the saddest thing about this is it continues. And only for ye here today, fighting the fight for your loved ones, for the government to say sorry. It is now in the history books as a milestone for this country that these people have prolonged to make sure they got the proper apology for their families. We have things happening in this country, in our hospitals, that they won't stand up and say sorry where people are dying in our hospitals on a daily basis. UHL Hospital in Limerick, and I'm sorry to have to bring this to you today. A young girl, Jessica Sheedy, and I have permission to mention her name, went for a minor operation over 3 years ago. And the inquest is still going on, even though all the information has been given 3 and 4 times over, because somebody won't stand up and say, I'm sorry. How many more inquests are going on around this country because people won't stand up and say the same thing, we got it wrong, I'm sorry. Let's make sure it protects children going forward and families going forward, and we fix this. But no, we tie it up in litigation, we tie it up in legal battles, and we tie it up in blame away from the people that were responsible, and we protected them. If we learn anything from today, from all these families, it's time now to stop this. Don't let another 43 years go by where you're going to have to say sorry to somebody else. And let me go on the record today. And you will say sorry to the people in UHL and other hospitals for introducing a hospital of excellence with a rising population and putting people in the areas and closing other elective surgeries in other hospitals and putting people at risk that died trying to get to the hospital. Not even getting to the hospital, that died. You will eventually have to apologise for that too, but you'll be at your retirement age and you leave it to somebody else. Fix it now. Say I'm sorry now. Make people accountable now. Fix the mistakes to protect the children of the future and the families of the future. And accept the liability that's there. Let's learn from it. And I have to thank you again for keeping the fight up. And I applaud you for it. Because now you might put down a milestone for the things that are going on and inquests that are going on today, and we will see in the history books again that you'll end up saying sorry for that too.
Deputy Matthew McGrath.
I go to Carhill, and a K-Dol Chiefs. I'd like to welcome the families in the gallery, and I met some of them outside and on the street, and indeed met people from my own constituency, Alison and Heather, and her mum was unable to come today, but they're weary and tired for fighting for justice for so long. I want to salute them. The disaster has been a long-standing symbol of injustice in our country. Not the only one, mind you. The 48 people who lost their lives in the Stardust were just teenagers. The youngest victim was only 16 and the oldest 27. The families of victims have been let down by successive governments. The state and legal system in its time for a state to apologise and establish a victims and families compensation scheme. But no amount of compensation will ever bring back the loved ones lost in the Stardust, and it's crucial that we acknowledge that. Compensation scheme serves a different purpose. It is not a solution to the pain and grief of the loss, but after a tangible recognition of the state's neglect and failure to protect its citizens. And that's ongoing all over this country today. As I said, the establishment of a compensation scheme free from obstacles is a necessary step towards justice. It acknowledges the time and angst that the families have lost and the struggle that they have had endured in their quest for justice.
The scheme should not be seen as a mere financial settlement, but a symbol of the state's commitment to righting the wrongs of the past, and they are many and they are awful. Moreover, this compensation scheme should serve as a reminder of the state's responsibility to ensure the safety and well-being of its citizens and to prevent such a tragedy from happening in the future. It is a testament to the resilience of the families, their unwavering pursuit of truth and their right to justice. It also calls it an accountability and demand for justice and pledge for a safer future. It is a promise that lives lost in the Stardust will never be forgotten, and that the legacy will continue to inspire change and foster resilience in the face of adversity. And I want to compliment and salute the coroner, Ms. Cullinan, and also Dublin Fire Brigade, in fairness at the time, and still to this day, salute them on the work they do. And you won't pay them or recognise them or give them proper treatment and respect. They took severe actions at the time, the fire officers, and in ensuring safety of all our public buildings, our nightclubs and public houses and everything else. For years, I said, the families were looking for a judgment, and the verdict of unlawful killing finally brought some relief. The verdict announced that by the jury and at the inquest for the 48 young people who tragically lost their lives in 1981 nightclub fire was met with a mix of emotions. And can I just say, it is just so sad. I was in Dublin that night. As a young man, I was at the Fianna Fáil audition. I was staying in a hotel, and we were terrified and frightened and horrified at what happened. And I remember the apology and the closing down of it the morning after. But we can never imagine or walk in the shoes of the families up here, as I said. But there are many more families walking in your shoes today. And I can mention him here. There are many of them. There's Fam Niall Malai, who was brutally killed at a wedding in Offaly with Tipperary relations. There is the Whiddy Island disaster, 50 people who lost their life. There's John and Michael O'Brien of Tipperary, who were literally murdered off the coast of Helvick 10 or 11 years ago. No investigation, cover up after cover up. And can we mention Shane O'Neill, that young cyclist who was mowed down unceremoniously on the road out for a cycle. And I salute his mother, Lucia, for the effort she's making to get justice. What is wrong? Why have we a system that we founded a state and our forefathers that fought and gave their lives in the GPO and all over the world and got our freedom and our new state? We inherited a system from the English to cover everything up and nothing to see here. Our people are being denied justice day in, day out. The unlawful killing of a young Rossiter by in Clonmel Garda station, covered up again. The wrongdoing is going on day in, day out to this very moment. It's probably happened to many families with Tusla at the moment of what's happening, young children in the care of the state going missing. In the name of God, I said, His Blessed Mother, and the dead generations, I appeal to you, if you're ever going to find any moral compass to stop this rot that's in there. We have a Minister of Justice won't even go to the Garda conference. We have the Commissioner wasn't even asked, and nor should he be. I don't blame him for that, they have no confidence in him. Will you stop the rot and stop just trying to destroy our very culture, our fabric, our being, and infiltrating our country and overrunning it with migrants from God knows where? Look after the people who need to be looked after, and have respect to your duty under the Constitution to serve the people, serve the Irish people, not self-serving. Why did that businessman, and I do question the previous Judge Keane, who appointed him? Who appointed him? Why did he find that out? I know who appointed him, and I know who his friends were. And that's what's going on to this day. The judges are appointed, and there's cover-up after cover-up. Shame on ye major political parties. You continue the farce.
Thank you, Deputy.
Chair. I want to start by quoting a piece in a headline on an article by Kitty Holland on her full story, the Stardust Fire Inquiries, and that is, Jesus Christ, the doors are locked. That is what survivors from the Stardust Fire have been saying for over 40 years. They were not believed, they were ignored, and as Antoinette Keegan has said, they have been systematically abused by the Irish establishment for the last 43 years. So I want to welcome to the gallery all the families of those who lost their loved ones. I want to welcome all those injured in the fire who carry physical and mental pain of that night 43 years ago. I'm glad that the families and the parents have fought for so long and hard, who never gave up, who have campaigned for truth and justice, and that you are here today after having earned the rightful verdict of unlawful killing and this apology from the state, so you can remember those who have passed over the last 43 years, and I salute you. This is the day to remember the 48 who died, the up to 200 injured, and over 600 who escaped with their lives. the workers in the Stardust, the emergency service workers, the taxi men who drove people from the Stardust to hospitals, who have carried the horrific memories of that night, and it's time that they have been vindicated. I'm very proud of this community. I came from this community. Myself and my brothers and my friends practically lived in the Stardust since it opened in 1978. It was the place to go. All working class kids in the area were there as often as possible. My brother Desmond Collins, who was 17 years of age, was in the Stardust that night. I've never publicly stated this, as he's been very private about his experience, and only on the anniversary every year would he ring up to say, it's that time of year again. I spoke to him since the inquest verdict, and he opened up a bit about the night. He said him and his pals were sitting in front of Paul Wade. Paul was our neighbour from across the road from us. Paul died that night and was only identified in 2007. In his pen portrait at the inquest, his brother Tony's son Emmett read the portrait of Paul. Tony was in Stardust that night as well, but survived, and the family, like every other family, were devastated. Their mum and dad never recovered. Des recounted the terror and the chaos in the venue, and the people clambering over seats and other people trying to get out, the darkness, the heat, the horror. He said he remembered the barman who eventually got the fire exit next to the bar near the stage open. That was the one exit that he got out of. It was exit 4. He said after the verdict last week that a weight had been taken off his shoulders, but what happened in the last 43 years should never have happened. All the victims need to be remembered and apologised to today, and the community who had to live with the Keane Tribunal of Inquiry verdict that the most probable cause was arson until 2009, 28 years later. This was a class issue. I felt it, the community felt it, and I don't believe that it would have taken 43 years to reach a verdict of unlawful killing if it had happened in a more affluent area. And I want to say to the families and the campaigners, you're a beacon of light to all those campaigns who are seeking truth and justice behind you. And I want to say to the Taoiseach that anything in relation to this issue must be done hand in hand with the families and the survivors. I want to read out this piece sent to me by Tommy Brohan, who was a TD for the community for 28 years and worked tirelessly to support the fight for the victims and their family. He states that February the 14th, 1981, 48 dead, 214 injured, over 80 seriously, out of 840 Stardust patrons. Deep anguish and grief was felt in Coolock, and the whole north side was hugely exasperated by the conclusion of the Keane Tribunal report in 1982. While most of the conclusion indicated that the cause of the fire would never be known, the Keane report suddenly ended by saying the fire was most probable cause by arson. A terrible slur was thus cast on the 48 young victims and the other Stardust victims. In the aftermath, the traumatised family, led by John and Chrissy Keegan, formed the Stardust Victims Committee. After John's sad and untimely death, Chrissy and her brilliant daughter Antoinette, Gertie Barrett, Breed McDermott, Eugene Kelly, Willie Mulvey and Jimmy Dunn were among the small core group which valiantly carried out on these decades, the decades-long struggle. Their campaign for a small redress scheme was successful, but was dwarfed by the €580,000 plus awarded to the Stardust owner based on Keane's totally erroneous final conclusion, and that was the probable cause was arson. Patrick Butterley wrote in his memoir, Radishes to Riches, that the Butterleys were all Fianna Fáilers. He was a member of the party's fundraising machine, TACA, in the 1970s and 80s. What you had these people for, he said, was to get things done. If you wanted someone who could do something, you asked them. And this was not lost on the people in our community. From 1986 to 1993, the Stardust Victims Committee, supported by Tommy, then a councillor, had a long struggle to force Taoiseach Charlie Haughey to grant Dublin Corporation $500,000 to build the beautiful Stardust Memorial Park in Bonnybrook, the central Coolock parish. Over the next decade or so, Tommy constantly raised the issue of establishing a new tribunal of inquiry to revisit the work and conclusions of the Keane report. His parliamentary questions and adjournment debates, etc., were underpinned by the work of a number of outstanding Irish journalists. In 2001, two brilliant young Northside journalists, Tony McCullough and Neil Featherstone-Hock, published a seminal book on the Stardust tragedy, They Never Came Home, The Stardust Story. This was the first study to directly challenge Keane and focus on the grossly deficient electrical fittings of the Stardust. The first decade of this century was a long struggle led by Chrissy and Antoinette Keegan to revisit Keane and finally correct the appalling conclusion of that report. A local Northside scientist, Ms Geraldine Foy, did the important work to try to locate the true cause of the fire, and a report titled Nothing But the Truth was submitted to Minister for Justice Michael McDowell in 2006. Finally, Mr now Judge Paul Coffey was appointed by the Ahern Government to carry out a review of new evidence on the Stardust. The subsequent 2009 Coffey report demolished the conclusion of the Keane report, which Coffey said was simply a hypothesis, and totally exonerated the 48 young victims and the other Stardust attendees. The Dáil then passed a legal adjustment to the Keane report, and Deputy Brahan read out the 48 names of Stardust victims into the Dáil. Remarkably, in an earlier unpublished draft of this report, Judge Coffey did indicate that a new tribunal was the best way forward, but this was quashed by the Cowan Fianna Fáil government. In the 2011 general election, Enda Kenny and Eamon Gilmore gave commitments to re-establish a tribunal of inquiry, but these commitments were cruelly broken in the subsequent austerity governments up to 2020. In 2014, Micheál Martin also committed to writing to a new tribunal, but despite his full support for the Kenny and Varadkar governments, he too refused to insist on a new tribunal. On every Stardust anniversary down to 2019, Deputy Brahan organised a Dáil debate in support of the now Stardust Victims and Relatives Committee for a new tribunal or commission of investigation under the 2004 Act. And this culminated in a motion in January 2017 calling for such a commission, which was defeated by 94 votes to 50, with Fine Gael, including the Taoiseach, Fianna Fáil and Minister Finian McGrath of Dublin Bay North voting against. Deputy Brahan then immediately called for the reopening of the Stardust inquest as the best option to a new commission of investigation. Tommy had contacted the Dublin City Coroner, Dr Myra Cullinan, in October 2016 and asked her to reopen the 1981 inquest, but she replied in 2017 that she had no jurisdiction to reopen the earlier inquest by the City Coroner, by the then City Coroner, Professor Boffin. Deputy Brahan then reminded the coroner of the reopening of the inquest into the victims of the Hillsborough tragedy in the UK and the fact there was no cause of death given on the death certificates of the 48 tragic victims of the Stardust. Later, in 2017, the Varadkar minority government appointed former Dublin North East Deputy and Judge Pat McCartan to carry out a review of new evidence unearthed by the Stardust Committee, journalists and fire experts to see if a commission of investigation or reopened inquest was justified. Judge McCartan decided they wouldn't be justified, and former Deputy Tommy Brahan commented that the judge had made a key mistake by ignoring the developments in the forensic science investigating fires over the past 4 decades. In 2018, Deputy Brahan moved a motion calling again for the reopening of the Stardust inquest, and in 2018-19, the Stardust Committee historically led a huge nationwide campaign, including collecting nearly 50,000 signatures of support from our fellow citizens to reopen the inquest. Finally, Taoiseach Leo Varadkar asked Attorney General Seamus Wolfe to review the issue, and in September 2019, the AG finally agreed to ask the City Coroner to reopen the Stardust inquest. Tommy goes on to say the verdict of unlawful killing delivered by the Stardust inquest jury last week was widely anticipated by those who attended the inquest at the Rotunda or followed it by Zoom. So first I'd like to thank the City Coroner for a very sensitive and legally rigorous conduct of the inquest. All those who called for justice for the 48 victims and the survivors and their families are also very grateful to Solicitor Darragh Mackin of Phoenix Law and his team of barristers for their presentation of the Stardust family's case at the inquest. We also remember the support of Charlie Board and our great musician Christy Moore, fire experts Tony Gillick, Professor Michael Dilichatsios of the University of Ulster, Paul Giblin of the Grenfell Fire Tragedy Campaigners, and the fire expert Dr Will Hutchinson, who gave the key forensic evidence to the inquest, must also be greatly commended. Most of all, we salute this afternoon Antoinette, her late ma'am Chrissy, her dad John, Gertie and Breed, who are the heroines of 43 years of desperate struggle, but their total vindication in the inquest jury's verdict is a huge contribution to Irish democracy and an inspiration to all other groups fighting for social justice in this country today. It is clearly now incumbent on Garda Síochána to urgently investigate and re-examine the performance of the owner and operator of the Stardust nightclub in the light of the evidence heard at the second Stardust inquest. It seems clear that a file will be prepared by for the Director of Public Prosecutions. The performance of the Planning, Fire Safety and Building Regulation Dublin City Council must also face deep scrutiny by Garda Síochána and the DPP. The enduring grief for their loss will never abate in Coolock, but at least now they may truly rest in peace.
Chairperson, I think I'm the last speaker on this. And Taoiseach, you've given a very fulsome address and a very fulsome apology, and that's to be welcomed. However, that apology will only be meaningful if it determines the next steps, if we're ahead. And number two, if it looks back as to how we are in this position. And so we're here today, and you talk about the institutions of the state let you down. They did a lot more than that. They actively contrived to prevent the truth coming out. They actively contrived against the families who are here today to get the truth. And the state institutions actively, if not actively, participated in a narrative that sought to defame those families. So it's a lot more than the institutions letting us down. And you pay tribute, and rightly so, to the three women who sat in the cold hut outside government buildings 15 years ago and who are here with us today, Gertrude Barrett, Antoinette Keegan and Bridget McDermott. But what you fail to say is the reason of why they were sitting out in the cold. And they were sitting out in the cold for something as basic as getting a copy of the Coffey report. And remember, the Coffey report came only after the government of the time set up a non-statutory inquiry, and the senior counsel Gallagher had to resign because he had already represented the guards. So we're here today because of the absolute courage, determination of the families who are here and who can't be here today. And it's actually a humbling experience. And it must be very uncomfortable for the families to sit through all of this, but it should be a lot more uncomfortable for us, actually, because governments up to now, right up to when this apology has been absolutely extracted on the pain and the death and the sufferings, the addictions that followed, the suicides that followed, from the absolute appalling misuse of power. And that's what we're talking about here. And we're talking about the famous class divide in Ireland that's never spoken about. And quite clearly, that's what happened here. And a narrative was determined from day one because the powerful were in charge. And the powerful have remained in charge. And the narrative has remained until today. And now it has been lifted off. And you've had to stand here as Taoiseach and tell people they're innocent, what they knew from day one. But the powerful told them differently through the institutions of the state. And let's have a quick, brief look at how we got here. We go back to 1981 and that dreadful night. And the word tragedy is used, and it was certainly a tragedy, but it was also no justice from day one, absolutely none. So we start with the tragedy on the Valentine's Day into the next morning. And then we have a tribunal set up with Ronan Keane. And that report was in June, a 687-page report, which reported in 82. And actually, quite a lot of that report was damning against the owners and against various institutions, including the local authority. However, he came to a conclusion that was utterly not based on what he had said, and indeed some of his paragraphs contradict previous paragraphs. So anybody with the evidence that was before him that could come out and say probable arson, the serious problem here, and your job and our job is to look back and say, how in God's name did that happen? And so after outlining all of the faults that he found in relation to, he was critical of the executive directors, he was critical of the safety measures and so on. And he says Mr. Butterley bears a responsibility for the practice of keeping the emergency exits secured with chains and padlocks, a recklessly dangerous practice which regularly endangered the lives of over 1,000 people and so on. They were the strong conclusions of Ronan Keane, who was a High Court judge at the time. And then he goes on to say probable arson. How could that happen? How could that happen? And then we go on forward, and what happens next? We have that actually tribunal was coexistent with the very faulty inquests that were held at the time for a few days that didn't look at the wider circumstances, but just gave us the medical cause of death. And then we go forward, and Mr. Butterley and his family, and we see that a compensation, he gets over £500,000 in 1985 for malicious damage. For malicious damage. And we have Mr. Justice Sean O'Hanrahan concluding that the Stardust fire was started maliciously, another judge backing up the narrative. And then we go forward to the Compensation Tribunal in 85, which was another insult to the families. And we have Mr. Justice Donald Barrington, a much respected judge, and we have all the applications. But there's no appeal from that except in relation to very specific law. And what's interesting about that is we're told that we can't compensate for mental upset. Can you imagine that? Imagine going through all of this to be told by a judge. And then we have John Keegan appealing that to the Supreme Court, and the narrative continues. And on the day that the Supreme Court refused his appeal on whatever narrow grounds he took, he dies on that day. And over along this period of 43 years, which I don't really have time to go into, but it's really important to remember this did not happen by accident. And we have Christy Moore's song, They Never Came Home. And as was mentioned before, he's held in contempt by Justice Frank Murphy, that the song was in contempt of court. He ruled that the lyrics of the song contained statements or comments calculated to prejudice a fair trial. But the comments by the establishment in relation to the people when they were telling lies according to the establishment, that wasn't prejudicing anything or looking down on anything. Here was the powerful protecting the powerful. We had a primetime programme in 2006. We had research on behalf of the families by Geraldine Foy, and named Nothing But the Truth and the case for a new public inquiry. Of course, that didn't happen either. And then we have we have the coffee report that I referred to, which was Bertie Ahern, and he announced an external independent examination. However, there was a conflict of interest, as I've pointed out, and then we come to coffee. And it's already been mentioned that his report had to be revised, and he gave the option there of, if you don't take out probable arson, then there should be a full public inquiry. And what did the government do? Not sort of say something seriously around here, we need a public inquiry. They take out the words and they leave everything else intact. And then we go forward, and the public record, thanks be to God, is corrected finally on that. And we go forward to the McCartan report, 2017, and he had insult to injury. And that report came on top of Deputy Bruin, who did tremendous work. I want to pay tribute to him. And he was my introduction to the Stardust fire when I became a TD in 16. And what does the former judge tell us? He tells us a dossier representing the case for a new inquiry was delivered to this assessment. What does he tell us about that? It was rambling, argumentative, disorganised, and at times incoherent. It was only at the end on page 358 that there was any statement of what the new evidence was. Difficult to understand, right up to 17. And then we go forward to 19, and we have the very courageous solicitor and the Phoenix Law. And they go through the European Convention of Human Rights. And Seamus Wolfe finally sees sense and says there must be new. And that's taken us from 2019 till last week when we got unlawful deaths. Now listen to what that's saying, unlawful deaths. So there has to be some accountability here in relation to who is responsible for the unlawful deaths. There has to be something for the government that recognises that in every single report that I've seen in my limited time in the Dáil, there's a self-serving narrative. We had the mother and baby home, and the report was never given. It was held on the shelves for months, and when it was finally given, they were told to download it. And then a scheme was set up where everybody under 6 months was excluded. So that narrative that persisted from the mother and baby home report, where the evidence, just like with this Ronan Keane, should have led to a different conclusion. It led to a conclusion that the evidence from the ordinary people was contaminated. Not the social workers, not the priests, not the judges, contaminated. I'm going to finish on it. So there's a narrative here, the same narrative in relation to the Kerry Babies Tribunal that was set up to investigate the guards, and we get a narrative about Joanna Hayes and her family. And they've got an apology. The survivors of Stardust have got an apology. But the establishment has learned absolutely nothing, because the powerful protect the powerful. And what's happened here was absolutely class distinction. And if you don't face that and begin to learn from that, we have learned nothing. I'm indebted to the survivors for making me think, reflect, and indebted to your courage. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Connolly, and that concludes statements of acknowledgement and apology to the families and the victims of the Stardust tragedy. And I just want to also thank you for being here today and to commend your fortitude and determination and resilience over the last 43 years, for doing something you shouldn't have had to do, but for seeing it through. I'm just in awe as well. Thank you very much. Okay, next item are questions to the Minister for Public Expenditure, National Development Policy, Delivery and Reform.